Hey friends! Tonight we're stepping into the muddy, barefoot world of medieval childhood because we're about to explore what kids did for fun long before playgrounds, cartoons, or anything even close to Fortnite. And let me tell you, it was chaotic, creative, and occasionally a little dangerous. This story is all about the wild, messy games kids played between chores, how they turned sticks into swords, mud into art, and goats into unwilling teammates. It's not polished, it's not fancy, but it's wonderfully human. So, as we ease into this soft and sleepy tale, I've got a question for you. Where are you listening from tonight? Got a snack nearby? Feeling cozy under a blanket, maybe with a cat at your feet? Let me know in the comments. I love seeing where our little sleepy history village is tuning in from. And if you enjoy this kind of gentle time travel, be sure to subscribe for more calming stories from the past. Now go ahead and dim the lights, close your eyes if you'd like, and let's drift into the soft, silly chaos of medieval playtime. Let's begin. The candles are low, the hearth is dim, and we're travelling back now, slowly, gently, to a time when the idea of childhood hadn't yet been given a name. In medieval villages, children were not seen as a separate class of humans to be protected, entertained, and observed with curiosity. They were simply smaller people. And small people, as the villagers might have said, had small hands ready for work. There were no toy boxes waiting by the fire, no dedicated school desks lined in neat rows, no parent-teacher conferences, no age-appropriate guidelines. A child might be 4 or 5 years old before anyone thought to remark on their age at all. More often, they were noticed by their usefulness. Could they carry water yet? Scatter feed for chickens? Sit still long enough to thread a needle or chase away crows? If so, then they were ready. But to imagine medieval childhood as completely grim would be to miss the strange sweetness of it. Though they were often expected to mimic adult roles, fetching, hauling, cleaning, or watching siblings, there was still room for mischief and joy. It wasn't that the Middle Ages had no love for children. It's just that childhood itself wasn't seen as a protected phase. Life was hard. Everyone helped. And that included the smallest feet in the house. From the moment a child could toddle steadily, they were put to tiny tasks. A toddler might be asked to blow on a coal to help rekindle the morning fire. A 5-year-old might trail behind a parent, gathering firewood or kindling fallen twigs. By 6 or 7, some were weaving reed mats, scaring away foxes from chicken pens, or even sent with older siblings to nearby fields. And yet, between these duties, there were sparks of play. Even a child dragging a pail of water might stomp in a puddle. Even a girl shelling peas might giggle with her sister, telling silly stories about talking turnips. These were not the structured, supervised playtimes we know today, but they were moments where imagination and joy slipped in, uninvited but welcome. To their elders, children were unfinished workers, apprentices to the craft of survival. They wore hand-me-down tunics and mismatched shoes. They slept in the same rooms as goats and parents alike. They learned by watching, copying, and being corrected. Praise was rare, but treasured, usually tied to usefulness. He's strong for his age, or she threads quicker than her mother did. In noble households, the expectations were no less steep, just different. A young lordling might be taught manners, Latin, or the art of falconry, while a noble girl was trained in embroidery, dance, and piety. Even play among the privileged was often preparation for adulthood. Toy swords were not just for fun, they were rehearsal. Miniature spinning wheels were not mere decoration, they were tools, scaled for small fingers destined to do more. But whether in manor or mud hut, children rarely had the luxury of idleness. They were folded into the rhythm of village life, as necessary and as unnoticed as the creak of a door or the cluck of a hen. Still, even in a world without childhood as we know it, fun found a way. A bundle of rags became a doll, a stick became a sword. A ring of siblings spinning in a circle could feel, if only for a moment, like a kingdom. So as we begin this slow unravelling of medieval play, it's worth remembering, these weren't children waiting to grow up. They were already halfway there. But in the spaces between labour and expectation, laughter lived. Hidden behind chores, behind scrapes and scoldings, was a quiet world of wonder. And it is to that world we now gently turn. Not the world of formal childhood as we know it, but one stitched into daily life like a patch on a worn tunic. where moments of joy weren't scheduled but stolen, where laughter wasn't planned but happened anyway. Even in a world where small hands were asked to work early and often, play still found a way, quietly, quickly, often in the in-between. Because for medieval children, time was measured not in hours or lessons, but in chores. Fetch water, gather kindling, stir the pot, keep the baby quiet, feed the chickens, weed the garden, help turn the drying herbs. These tasks were never ending, and many had to be done before the sun vanished behind the trees. But between them, between the firewood and the flax, the barley and the bramble, there were pockets of time that didn't belong to the grown-ups. And those little gaps, that's where the fun lived. A child might finish scattering grain for the hens, then spend a moment chasing the boldest one just to see it flap and squawk. Another might drag a pail from the well, then pour the last inch of water onto a patch of dust to draw a smiley face with a stick. They didn't ask for permission to play. They didn't need to. They simply slipped into it, like a breeze through a crack in the shutters. There was no dividing line between work and fun. One bled into the other. A chore could become a game if the child willed it so. Two siblings told to gather apples might race to find the biggest one. A girl watching the goat herd might hum little songs to herself and pretend she was the queen of the hillside. A boy left to mind a cauldron might blow puffs of air at the steam and imagine he was taming a dragon. Even the tools of labour doubled as toys. A long-handled broom became a steed. A wooden spoon became a sceptre. A pile of stones could be sorted, stacked, traded, or tossed in a silent contest. The imagination didn't ask for much, it just asked for a moment. And that moment, no matter how fleeting, mattered. Because in those brief respites, children weren't just rehearsing joy, they were recovering from effort. Resting their hands, flexing their minds, reminding themselves that life, while demanding, could also be silly, beautiful, shared. Even the older folk knew this, deep down. A mother might scold a son for skipping a task, but then smile when she saw him pretending to joust with a stalk of wheat. A father might shake his head at a muddy dress, but not say a word if the mess came from a flower crown made in a ditch. It wasn't that parents encouraged idleness. They couldn't afford to. But they understood that a child with room to laugh was a child more likely to wake up strong, so they allowed the wiggle room. Not always, but often enough. In the winter months when the daylight grew short and the work moved indoors, even more of these playful interludes emerged. As mothers spun yarn or cooked, children might play on the floor with scraps of cloth, inventing characters or copying their parents' motions. While fathers mended tools, children poked sticks in the hearth and made up stories about animals in the smoke. Nothing grand, nothing planned. Just little flickers of fun like candlelight flickering at the edges of daily life. Fun in the medieval world wasn't something you earned at the end of the week. It wasn't a reward. It was woven directly into the weave of living. It had to be. There were no weekends, no screens, no toy stores, just mud and sky, chores and closeness. And within that closeness, the opportunity to share a laugh or a game with a sibling, a friend, or even just the dog. It may not have been the kind of fun we recognise today, but it was theirs, and for all its roughness, it kept their spirits whole. So as we move forward, deeper into the games themselves, the rowdy ones, the risky ones, the joyful ones, it's worth remembering this. The best kind of fun doesn't wait for the perfect time. It finds its way through cracks. It plays between tasks. And in the Middle Ages, it did just that. The best kind of fun doesn't wait for the perfect time. It finds its way through cracks. It plays between tasks. And in the Middle Ages, it did just that. But this wasn't just harmless mischief or idle silliness. No, play had a purpose. Even in a world ruled by routine, by hunger and harvest, by sunup and sundown, there was a quiet, unspoken understanding. Children needed more than discipline to grow. They needed space to stumble, to laugh, to imagine and to try. Play wasn't just tolerated, it was essential. The medieval world was often harsh. Many children would not survive infancy. Those who did were often reminded by life itself that survival came with cost, work, sacrifice and obedience. But children are not made only for labour. Their minds reach even when their hands are tired. They question even as they mimic. And so, in a world where very little was guaranteed, play became a form of resilience. It taught them things long before formal instruction ever entered their lives. A child who built a game from pebbles was learning how to sort, to count, to compare. A group of children who turned a field into a fortress were practicing strategy, negotiation, and imagination. Pretending to be a mother or knight wasn't just mimicry. It was rehearsal for adulthood, a way to try on the future before it was thrust upon them. Even the church, that great moral compass of the Middle Ages, never outright forbade children from playing. There were warnings, of course, about idleness, vanity, mischief, but laughter itself was not a sin. In fact, some medieval sermons and writings noted that children's games revealed the soul's innocence, and their joy was a mirror of divine playfulness. A child's giggle in a field, then, was not just tolerated, it was a reminder of something pure. Among peasants especially, who had little in the way of formal education or written tradition, play became a teacher. It was how children learned to move through the world. They learned patience through turn-taking, empathy through pretend games, courage by climbing things they probably shouldn't have. They learned balance on fences. They learned cause and effect by poking things with sticks. They learned rhythm in clapping games and riddles sung around the fire. Fun wasn't always safe, and it wasn't always pretty. There were scrapes, bruises, and the occasional torn tunic. But there was learning in those falls. Real learning, the kind that sticks. No one needed to lecture about consequences after a child tumbled into a cold trough. They felt it, they knew, and they carried that knowing with them. The grown-ups knew too. Perhaps not in words, but in the way they glanced, half smiling, as their children played in the hay. A mother might correct a child's poor weaving, but say nothing when she saw them braiding wildflowers into their hair. A father might sigh at muddy footprints, but let the children run through the field anyway, because he remembered running once too. Play reminded everyone, child and adult alike, that life wasn't just toil, that amid the hunger, the cold, and the repetition there was room for delight. That even in a world of need, joy was not a luxury. It was a form of survival, a thing that kept spirits light even when the belly was not full. It's easy to think of medieval childhood as joyless, but that would be to mistake poverty for emptiness. These children didn't have carved dolls or organised clubs. They had rope swings made from frayed flax. They had imaginary dragons and thrones shaped from tree stumps. They had each other, and that was often enough. So yes, play was necessary, not just because it helped children grow, but because it reminded them and their elders that they were still human, still whole, even in the dirt and the dark. In the next part of our journey, we'll step into the village itself, a place where every lane, fence and pigsty could become a playground. Because while childhood was rarely separated from the rest of life, it did have a stage. And that stage was often the village itself. But for now, stay settled, breathe slow, and imagine a child crouched in the dust, eyes wide with wonder, turning a handful of pebbles into a kingdom of their own. Let's keep going soon. But for now, stay settled, breathe slow, and imagine a child crouched in the dust, eyes wide with wonder, turning a handful of pebbles into a kingdom of their own. Because for many medieval children, the world itself was their toy chest. Not a separate room filled with brightly coloured plastic, but a place stitched with hedgerows, troughs, hay bales, fences and puddles. The village, the very heart of daily life, was also the stage on which children played. It wasn't designed for them. Nothing was. But that never stopped them. Children had a way of taking what existed and remaking it through imagination. A patch of hard-packed earth beside a stable became a battlefield. A stone trough, still dripping from a rinsed tunic, became a dragon's cave. The broken handle of a cart might become a noble lance, and the water spilled from washing greens turned into slippery lanes for sliding and squealing. The village paths, worn down by feet and hooves, were wide enough for chasing games and narrow enough to spark whispered dares. Run from the bakery to the mill without touching the ground, one might say. And just like that, barrels became stepping stones, fences became balance beams, and a low-hanging branch was suddenly an archway into an invisible realm. They knew every inch, every knot in the wood of the tavern door, every tree with a hollow big enough to hide a secret, every smooth stone that could be thrown farthest or spun on one finger like a top. The village, well, for adults was a source of water and gossip. For children, it was a meeting point, a game zone, a place to argue over rules or start a new adventure. Animals, too, became unwitting co-stars in their stories. A flock of geese might be a band of enchanted guardians, a grumpy goat, the dragon to be avoided. Chickens were chased, much to their irritation. Cats were followed, though they rarely appreciated the company. Dogs, if friendly, were allies, knights, companions on every muddy quest. The adults were never far, a mother scrubbing laundry, a blacksmith hammering, a baker pulling loaves from the oven. But medieval life was not closely supervised, and children learned quickly how to dodge a grown-up's eye when the game required sneaking, hiding, or crossing into places they weren't quite allowed. There was no clear border between the safe and off-limits areas. The entire village was alive and in motion, people, animals, carts, tools. A child had to learn quickly how to dodge a cartwheel, avoid a grumpy swineherd, or flatten themselves against a wall to avoid a wet shirt flung from a washtub. And in that constant dance of movement, they also learned caution, instinct, speed. Not taught in words, but absorbed through experience. Even the churchyard, solemn and sacred, was not untouched. Children were told to be quiet there, to show respect. But that didn't mean their eyes stopped noticing the curve of a gravestone that looked like a hill, or the way old Father Benoit's cat always slept on the warm stone bench at midday. Some villages even allowed children to play small games near the edge of the yard, as long as no shouting interrupted the prayers. Everything was dual purpose. The stairs weren't just for climbing. They were for sitting, sorting treasures, or staging whispered plays. The edges of the thatched roofs weren't just shelter, they were challenges. Could you jump and touch them? Could you toss a pebble up and hear it land? These weren't organised games. There were no referees or schedules. But the play was rich, dense with rules that changed daily, packed with imagination that turned the ordinary into the enchanted. And through it all, the village watched. Not always kindly, not always patiently. But somewhere in the back of every adult's mind was a distant echo, a memory of when they too had hidden behind the firewood pile or swung from the low branch by the stable door, when they too had turned the mundane into magic. So the village endured it, the noise, the muddy footprints, the shrieks and whispers, because even in a life shaped by labour there was still space, however narrow, for childhood to live in the open. In the next chapter, we'll step out of the village lanes and into the dust and mud, the tools, scraps, and found treasures that became games of dirt and imagination. Because for medieval children, you didn't need much to have fun. You only needed time and a little freedom, and perhaps a patch of dirt. Because when the chores were finished, or at least paused, and the village had offered all it could in fences, corners, and low branches, there was always the ground. The earth beneath the feet of every child, dry in summer, squelching in spring, hardened in winter, and sticky in the in-between. The mud, the dust, the clay, these were toys before toys existed. Children in the Middle Ages did not ask for polished trinkets or brightly painted dolls. Most never dreamed of such things. What they had instead was access to the most abundant material in their world, the soil. It needed no coins, it broke no rules, it was simply there. And it could be anything. A lump of damp earth could be pinched into a piglet. A little more pressure, and it was a horse. Add pebbles for eyes, a sprig of grass for a tail, and suddenly the creature had life. Not forever, it might be trampled or dry into dust by morning. But in that hour, in that moment, it was real. Some children created small villages in the mud, mimicking their own. Twigs became rafters, leaves rooftops, stones made excellent ovens, a bent feather was a broom. The baker, the blacksmith, the shepherd, all were recreated in miniature, performed with quiet focus. A small thumb pressing a chimney into a clay roof. A child whispering the voice of a tiny market lady, a world within a world. For others, the ground was a canvas, a stick drawn through dust, made roads, boundaries, symbols no one else understood. Circles, spirals, grids for games known only to the children who invented them. The wind might erase it all by sunset, but that didn't matter. The making was the joy, the process was the play. Mud itself, thick, cold, and squishy, offered its own pleasures. A rainy afternoon might mean squelching through puddles, splattering trousers, and testing how far a foot could sink before someone called you back. Bare toes pressed deep into cool mud, palms painted in it, then pressed against a stone wall to leave a mark, a moment of presence. "I was here," the handprint said, until it dried and crumbled away. Not all dirt was play, of course. Many children had to haul it, dig it, or sweep it. But in those in-between moments, when no one was watching too closely, the very same dirt became a companion. It did not judge, it did not break, it did not cost anything, and it was endlessly, beautifully transformable. In some places, especially near rivers or streams, clay was a prized material, smoother than regular soil, more mouldable. Children who lived near such banks might sneak away with fists full of the grey stuff, shaping beads, bowls, or tiny animals. Some were left to dry in the sun, others crumbled before they ever made it home. But they served their purpose, to fill time with creation, with story, with quiet joy. Even older children, on the brink of labour and marriage, sometimes return to the dirt. In private moments, they still traced spirals in the sand. They still stacked pebbles without purpose. It wasn't childishness, it was memory. It was something rooted deeper than age. And of course, there was always the mess of it. Mud on sleeves, dust on knees, smudged cheeks, a mother's sigh as she scrubbed a tunic. But often she'd smile too, because she remembered the feel of it between her own fingers, the way it cooled a sun-warmed palm, the way it turned nothing into something. Dirt, then, was not just the ground they walked on. It was a friend, a medium of play, a silent partner in a world that often had little to give. And in its wettest, wildest form, it became a full-body experience, one that soaked into the tunic and stayed beneath the fingernails long after bedtime. As we move forward, we'll look beyond the soil itself to the tools of play that came from the world around them, twigs and stones, leaves and bone, because if mud was the clay of the imagination, the things it touched next became the bones of whole new worlds. But for now, picture a child crouched low beside a puddle, sculpting a crooked little horse with the tip of their finger. The village buzzes in the background. The world is wide. But for a few minutes, everything that matters fits in the palm of a muddy hand. And when that hand was wiped clean on a tunic or a patch of grass, it often reached for something else. A stick, perhaps, or a stone, or a bundle of both. For medieval children, these were more than scraps from the natural world. They were tools, props, weapons, crowns. They were whatever the imagination required. A stick could be a walking staff, a shepherd's crook, a broom, or a sword. In the right hands, or rather the right mindset, it could become all of those in a single afternoon. A group of children might break from their chores, each clutching a long branch or crooked twig, and suddenly the village square was a battlefield. Shouts rang out, blades clashed, gently usually, and every fallen opponent promised revenge in the next round. Of course, there were no real injuries intended, most of the time, but bruised shins and scraped elbows were part of the experience. There were no foam swords or safety padding here, just rough wood and a bit of trust. And often a pecking order, an older sibling who always got to be the king, a younger one who always played the horse. But not all sticks were made for battle. Some became fishing rods with no hooks. Some were whittled, if a child had access to a knife or a sharp stone, into spears, arrows, or little tools. Others were simply collected for their shape. A forked branch made at an excellent slingshot frame. A straight reed might become a flute with a hole poked through. And in the colder months, a sturdy stick served as a crutch on icy ground or a pole to knock down icicles with theatrical flair. Stones, too, had endless potential, not just for throwing, though they certainly were, but for lining game boards scratched into the earth, for stacking into towers, for counting, trading, or claiming territory. Smooth stones were favoured, especially ones with unusual colours or patterns. These were the treasures of a medieval child, picked up during a walk and stashed in a pocket to be admired later or shown to a friend as proof of good fortune. Certain types of rocks made particular sounds when struck. Some could chip other stones into new shapes. A child might spend an hour seeing which ones skipped best across a pond or which made the loudest clack when banged together. There were no instructions, just experimentation, instinct and discovery. Put together, sticks and stones formed the building blocks of entire imagined worlds. One child might arrange them into the outline of a castle. Another might craft a set of tools for a pretend bakery. A fallen log became a throne. A hollow stump became a dungeon, a ring of stones, a fortress, a collection of straight twigs, a guard patrol. In every corner of the village or beyond its edge, small kingdoms rose and fell. Some lasted the afternoon. Others returned each day, adjusted and rebuilt as if the fantasy had its own seasons. A patch of grass, a pile of rocks, a hidden clearing in the woods, these were the theatres of play, with sticks and stones for cast and crew. These items were not gifts. No adult handed them over with instructions. They were found, claimed, repurposed. And in that act of claiming, the child declared something simple but powerful. This is mine. This is my game. And while the grown-ups seldom joined, they saw it. A father might pause, axe in hand, watching his son balance a twig on his shoulder like a soldier on parade. A grandmother might smirk just slightly at the way her granddaughter tried to herd chickens with a bent reed. No one said much. But the presence of play, however rough or ridiculous, was always noted, always remembered. In a world with few possessions, where most children owned nothing of their own, these bits of the earth became everything. Their toys, their tools, their symbols of identity, not because they were rare, but because they were claimed through effort and story. And when play was done, when the sun slipped behind the hill or a parent called from across the yard, these treasures were left behind without sadness, because there'd be more tomorrows, more sticks, more stones, more stories to carve into the dust. Next, we'll look at how children turned the simplest scraps into homemade dolls and woven critters. Objects crafted not just for fun, but for care, company and comfort. But for now, picture the quiet clatter of pebbles being gathered, the proud grip on a crooked stick, and the look on a child's face when they find the perfect stone, smooth and warm in the palm of their hand. It was the same look seen in another corner of the yard or cottage, where a child sat cross-legged on a blanket or a mat of straw, quietly shaping something small, something precious. Because not every game was rowdy, not every joy was loud. Sometimes fun came with stillness and with hands busy in the quiet act of making. In a world where few possessions existed, toys were rarely bought. For most medieval children, there were no shelves of dolls, no painted figurines in boxes, no shelves lined with plush animals. But that didn't mean they went without. Instead, they made their own. Crudely, yes, but with intention, care, and imagination. A homemade doll could begin with almost anything, a bundle of rags tied with thread, a stick wrapped in wool, a corn cob with scraps of cloth knotted into arms. Some had faces stitched with rough thread or dabbed with ash to mark eyes and a mouth. Others were faceless, loved just the same. It didn't matter. The child gave it life, not through detail, but through attention. These makeshift companions were cradled, sung to, tucked to corners of hay. They were fed pretend meals made of stones and leaves. They were carried around the village, introduced to friends and animals, or dressed in strips of discarded cloth. And sometimes in the arms of a child whose hands also soothed younger siblings or carried firewood, the doll became more than a toy. It became a practice of nurturing, of stillness, of love. Boys, too, had their companions. Not always shaped like people, sometimes like animals, creatures made from straw, twisted into the form of a goat or horse. Others used stiff weeds braided and bent, or sticks wound with scraps of yarn, legs made from twine, tails of string. A beetle shell tied with thread might become a pretend helmet for a mouse-sized knight. Small bones from kitchen scraps, cleaned and polished, became miniature tools, cattle horns or tusks in an imaginary hunt. Children made what they saw. And in villages surrounded by animals, livestock, birds, dogs, cats, the inspiration was endless. A piglet woven from straw didn't just serve as a toy. It was a way of understanding the world, of naming the parts, of practicing responsibility. Some children named their creatures, others didn't need to. The story lived in the making. Mothers and grandmothers often helped, not always overtly, but subtly. A girl might be given a few extra scraps from a worn shift, accidentally left behind. A boy might be handed a piece of twine, not quite good enough for tying herbs. And in that quiet offering, the adult allowed the child's world to grow. Even in noble households, where store-bought toys might appear now and then, a carved figurine, a painted rattle, handmade playthings still endured. A lady's maid might craft a doll from lace scraps. A young page might shape a horse from candle wax, pressing it smooth with warm fingers. Because even among wealth, the instinct to create remained. These toys were not expected to last. Many would fall apart by week's end. Rain would soften straw, mice would steal bits of wool, the dog would chew the doll's foot. But the beauty wasn't in the preservation. It was in the moment of possession, of saying, I made this, and knowing that it was theirs. Sometimes these toys became part of larger games. Dolls became queens in stick castle courts. Woven animals grazed in circles of stones, herded by shepherds carved from bark. And when the game was done, the toy might be hidden in a fold of fabric, kept safe from siblings or wind. And sometimes, especially in the quiet before sleep, a child might curl around their crude creation, hand resting lightly on a doll's stitched chest or the lumpy straw of a goat's head. There were no lullabies from soft electronics, no plush blankets covered in cartoons. But there was comfort. There was the knowledge that something had been shaped by their own hands, that something soft or strange or sweet had come into the world because they had imagined it. In the next section, we'll step even deeper into this world of pretend, of mimicry, of becoming, because before long, every child begins to act out the stories around them, and we'll see how the joy of imitation became one of the earliest and most important games of all. But for now, picture a girl smoothing the ragged hem of her cloth doll, a boy twisting straw into a makeshift tail, and the calm, deep quiet of a world where joy was simple and made from scraps. It's in this quiet that something deeper begins to stir. For as soon as children shaped dolls and wove animals, they began to wonder what it meant to be them, to act like them, to speak for them. And in doing so, medieval children stepped into one of the most powerful forms of play, imitation. For a child in a medieval village, the world was full of roles, each one visible, repetitive, and deeply familiar. Every day they watched their mothers bake bread, tend goats, spin wool. They saw their fathers in the fields or by the forge. They watched older brothers split firewood and older sisters sweep ashes from the hearth. And from these observations, a game emerged. Not with rules or winners, but with mirrors. Children mirrored what they saw, not because they were told to, but because the rhythms of daily life were so present, so constant, that they naturally bled into play. A girl might crouch behind a tree, gently rocking her cloth doll and humming a lullaby she'd overheard just that morning. A boy might slap together 2 pieces of firewood and pretend to shoe a horse, puffing out his cheeks the way the blacksmith always did. Sometimes they would even gather in groups to perform these adult roles together, each one taking a turn as the baker or the priest, the miller or the merchant. They mimicked the voices they knew, the walks they saw, even the scoldings they had received. The games could be simple, like pretending to make a stew from mud and leaves, or complex, like staging a wedding between 2 dolls, with pine cones for guests and chickens for witnesses. There were no costumes, only approximations. A child might drape a shawl over their head to become a mother. A wooden spoon tucked into a belt might signal a sword. A basket on the back could mean a travelling merchant or a wandering friar. The imagination filled the gaps and everyone understood who was being portrayed, even if the impersonation was exaggerated, silly, or entirely inaccurate. In these games, children weren't just passing time, they were rehearsing. They were studying the adult world by becoming it, if only for a moment. They learned empathy through imitation. They practiced responsibility, conflict, and even kindness by pretending to solve problems as their parents did, or as they believed their parents ought to. Imitation also offered a kind of gentle power. In a world where children had little control, to step into an adult's role, even briefly, was a quiet act of empowerment. To command a group of dolls as though they were a household, to give pretend sermons like the village priest, to shout orders in a game of castle or marketplace, these were moments when a child could lead, decide, create. And not all imitation was about grown-ups. Children mimicked animals too, walking on all fours, bleating like goats, flapping arms like wings, hiding behind hay bales like foxes in the forest. These games were often wild, silly, and full of laughter. But even they had a place in a world where humans and animals lived closely. To pretend to be a dog was not just entertainment, it was a way of understanding how the world moved. Sometimes adults even played along. A mother might let a child cook beside her, giving them a pot with stones and herbs. A father might allow his son to mend a broken tool with a stick and a frown. It wasn't indulgence, it was education through pretending. And while it may have looked like nonsense from a distance, these quiet acts of mimicry were building bridges to the future. For children of the Middle Ages, there were no rehearsals for adulthood. Life didn't pause for childhood. So imitation became their classroom. And in that classroom, made of dirt floors and thatch walls, they practiced for lives that would come far too soon. But even knowing that, the games never lost their spark. The laughter remained. The joy in pretending to be a mother, a knight, a dog, or a priest never stopped being real. Because in the end, play was how children made sense of their world. It was how they tried on its pieces, one at a time, until they fit. And in the next chapter, we'll run with them, barefoot and breathless, as we explore the thrill of running wild and free, chasing each other through lanes and fields in the purest kind of game, the joy of movement. But for now, let your mind rest in a scene of make-believe. A child wearing a too big bonnet, stirring a pot of leaves, scolding her dolls in her mother's voice. Outside, the goats bleat, the sky darkens, and the grown-ups busy with real work smile quietly, because they remember. They remember the freedom of small feet thudding across packed earth. The shrieks of mock terror, the bursts of wild laughter, the chase that begins with a nudge and ends in breathless collapse. Because while pretending and play acting had their place, there was a kind of joy that lived not in objects or stories, but in motion itself. In running, full tilt, arms flailing, eyes wide, in games that required nothing but space and speed. For medieval children, movement was its own reward. Their lives were not sedentary. Their bodies were accustomed to walking long distances, carrying loads, balancing on unstable ground. But still, there was a difference between walking because you must and running because you can. And the most universal game of all, the one that echoed across villages, across fields, across generations, was the chase. Tag, though it may not have gone by that name, was already a favourite. A child tapped on the shoulder would suddenly become it, charged with chasing down their playmates while the others squealed and scattered. But in a world without playgrounds or rubber mats, the rules shifted with the setting. A game played in a muddy lane required different skills than one played in a hayloft. The terrain shaped the strategy, and every version of the game had its own twist. Sometimes the safe zone was the stone wall beside the church. Other times it was the tree with the twisted branch near the goat pen. Children invented the rules as they went. You can't be tagged if you're touching wood. You can only run in circles, you can only hop. The variations were endless, often argued over, always fluid. There were no referees, just loud voices, fast feet, and the occasional shove that led to scrapes and bruises. And yet, these were not careless games. They were highly attuned. Children knew where the loose stones were, which fences wobbled, which puddles were shallow, and which ones swallowed a whole foot. They knew how to swerve past a startled goose or duck under a laundry line. In motion, they were agile, responsive, and inventive. These games didn't require encouragement. In fact, they were often the games played when no one was looking, when chores were done early, or when adults were too busy to notice a group of children sneaking away behind the stables. Sometimes the game started with no plan at all. One child ran, the others followed, and suddenly a whole afternoon unfolded in pursuit and escape. Even in colder months, the spirit of the chase lived on. Children darted between piles of firewood, chased each other through the smoke of outdoor fires, or raced to the well and back with frost nipping at their fingers. The cold made the game sharper. The air in their lungs stung, but the joy was enough to keep them warm. There were games, too, where chasing had a different rhythm. Circle games sung in rhyme, where one child skipped around the others until a new it was chosen. These were quieter, often played by younger children or those minding a sibling. But even here, the movement brought delight. Spinning in circles, hopping on one foot, swinging arms in time with a chant half remembered from older cousins. And beyond the structured games, there was the simple joy of running just to run, dashing across a field with no one chasing, just to feel the wind pull at your tunic. Racing a friend from one end of the pasture to the other, jumping over puddles, vaulting narrow ditches, sprinting through tall grass and pretending it was a forest. There were no medals, No praise, just exhilaration and the flush of effort warming a tired body. When the running slowed, it was always sudden. A call from a doorway, a clanging pot, the smell of bread or stew drifting from a kitchen. One by one, the game would unravel, players slipping back into doorways, onto stools behind parents' legs as if they'd never been away. But the laughter lingered, the red cheeks, the grass-stained knees, the proud retelling of who almost caught whom, and the memory of movement, fast, fearless, free, carried them through the stillness that followed. Next, we'll step into the heart of winter, where movement took on a different tone, quieter, slower, sometimes slippery. Because even when the world was cold and the ground was hard, play did not stop. It simply changed shape, but for now, rest in the memory of bare feet slapping stone, a triumphant grin, a hand stretched out in chase and another just out of reach. Sometimes that hand caught its target, other times it missed, and the chase gave way to a fall. A tumble through long grass, a misstep in the dirt, a full-body somersault down a gentle slope, and far from ending the fun, those spills often made it better. Because for medieval children, the world itself, uneven, unpredictable, and wonderfully wild, was the greatest obstacle course they could ask for. There were no padded mats or organised races, no carved jungle gyms or structured climbing frames. But there were fields, there were ruins, there were hills to roll down, walls to leap from, gullies to straddle, tree roots to dodge, and the crooked bones of crumbling buildings to clamber over with grinning delight. Fields that had long since been harvested or left fallow were playgrounds in disguise. Rough ground with tufts of grass became hopscotch boards, even if no one had given the pattern a name. Children leapt from stone to stone, ran narrow furrows like winding paths, or rolled themselves down soft slopes until their tunics were stained with green and their heads spun with giddy dizziness. In the edge spaces where pasture met woodland, or beyond the hedge where old Roman walls still poked through the earth, more dangerous adventures awaited. Fallen stones became balancing beams, low walls became ledges to jump from, vines became swinging ropes if the child was daring, and many were. The ruins of old chapels or abandoned barns were especially exciting, full of shadows, dust, and strange echoes. Forbidden, usually. But that only made them more thrilling. Older children led the way. They knew the safest spots. The barn roof corner where you could jump without twisting your ankle, the slope behind the inn where the grass made for soft landings. They taught the younger ones how to leap properly, how to land with bent knees, how to tumble and roll without getting winded. These lessons weren't spoken, they were passed along in action, gesture, imitation, and with those movements came pride. It wasn't just about fun, it was about mastery. Learning to leap across the brook without getting wet, climbing a fence in one smooth motion, balancing across a fallen beam without touching the ground. These were small triumphs in a world where children had few chances to feel powerful, to move with purpose, to conquer space, to test one's own body and emerge laughing. This was a kind of victory. Not all jumps were clean. Not all falls ended in laughter. There were bumps, bruises, and the occasional twist or sprain. A child might limp home, face streaked with dirt and pride a little dented, but even then there was a story. A tale to be told and retold. The time they tried to leap across 2 stones and landed in a puddle. The time the tree branch snapped but they caught themselves. The time they almost touched the top of the ruined chapel wall. The world was not soft, but it was full of invitation. The jagged edges, the shifting ground. These things didn't deter children. They shaped their play, made it more inventive, more reactive, more real. They taught the body to think, the hands to grab quickly, the feet to trust their own rhythm. And in these rough games, this rolling, leaping, tumbling, children discovered something timeless. That joy doesn't always come from winning. It often comes from trying. Even the animals joined in their way. Dogs barked and ran alongside. Goats stood in judgment at the top of the hill. Cats watched from windowsills as children scrambled and skidded and shouted. And the grown-ups, as always, watched with one eye, pretending not to notice unless someone cried out. Eventually the movement slowed. The sun dipped. The dirt clung. A dozen small bodies, breathless and dirty, collapsed in a heap of limbs and laughter at the edge of a field. They might not have had much, but they had this. Space, energy. and a world that, while rough around the edges, welcomed them just the same. Next, we'll step into another beloved kind of game, hide and seek, not with playgrounds or painted corners, but with hay bales, chicken coops, and thatched shadows, because the thrill of disappearing and being found is older than any rule book. But for now, picture a child perched on a crumbling stone wall, knees scraped, eyes bright, smiling wide, ready to leap. And after the leap came the landing, sometimes clean, sometimes crooked, and sometimes, once the breath had returned and the legs stopped trembling, a new challenge called from just a few steps away: the narrow fence, the sagging beam, the rail of an old cart. Because for a certain kind of child, and there were many, nothing tempted the imagination quite like a long, thin stretch of wood that begged to be crossed. Balancing was not a formal skill, not something anyone was taught in words, but every medieval child learned it, sooner or later, because the village and the farmyard were full of lines to walk. Fences separated gardens, rails bordered pens, wooden beams stretched across barn interiors like tight ropes, dusty and splintered, just waiting to be tested. Some fences were solid, some wobbled terribly, and all of them held the promise of adventure. It usually started small, 1 foot on a beam, arms out, a cautious step forward, a friend nearby watching with narrowed eyes, ready to follow. Then another step, a shift, a wobble, a laugh, and then the challenge was spoken aloud. Bet you can't do it all the way to the post. Suddenly it was a game. Children crossed these beams with a seriousness far beyond their years, tongues pressed between lips, arms flailing like wings. The goal was not speed, but mastery, to reach the end without falling, without hopping off early, without grabbing the side in a moment of panic. Some would hum little songs to help keep the rhythm. Others would speak softly to themselves, casting the balance as a mission. The edge of a castle wall, the rail of a ship, the narrow bridge across a cursed ravine. Splinters were common. Knees bore the evidence. But no one minded too much. A sharp jab in the palm, a streak of blood across the shin. These were accepted as the price of the game. Often a child would pause, pick the wood from their skin with practiced fingers and continue as if nothing had happened. The risk was part of the thrill. Falling off was noisy, sometimes funny, occasionally dramatic. A child might collapse in exaggerated fashion, arms sprawled, moaning as if slain in battle. Friends would cheer or groan depending on the stakes, but always someone else would climb up next, ready to try. The beam, after all, wasn't going anywhere, and balance was earned, not given. There were higher beams too, more dangerous, more tempting. The cross supports in barns or sheds, just high enough to make an adult shout if they noticed. These were the secret courses, the ones whispered about and conquered only in moments of freedom. A climb up the ladder, a shimmy across the rafters, a crawl on hands and knees while trying not to disturb the swallows nesting above. These victories weren't always shared. Sometimes they lived quietly in the memory of the child who'd done it, feet swinging from the top rail, looking out over the hay below with a private sense of triumph. Even fences served multiple roles. One moment a path to walk, the next a stage for performing, a place to perch, a place to wait, a place to sit shoulder to shoulder with friends and swing legs, sharing secrets. For children with few belongings and fewer places to claim as their own, a fence could become a throne. A beam could become a border between worlds. And beneath the balancing, there was something more, a slow, wordless learning of how to move in space, how to shift weight, how to recover from a slip, how to trust your feet. These lessons, learned with scratched palms and laughing gasps, became part of the body's knowledge. They made the world feel less unpredictable, less overwhelming. The adults didn't always approve. A snapped fence rail, a broken slat, these brought reprimands. But rarely did the play stop entirely. Even the grown-ups, scolding with stern voices, often turned away with a hidden smile. They too had walked that beam once. Next, we'll follow those same children into the barns and stables where beams gave way to shadows, where hiding was an art and seeking a challenge. Because the quiet drama of hide and seek wasn't just a game, it was a test of cunning, of patience, and of knowing every nook and corner in a world made of wood and straw. But for now, picture a dusty rafter. A child, arms out, brow furrowed, 1 foot placed in front of the other. Not fast, not fearless, but determined, balancing between work and wonder. And when the balancing was done, when the wobble of the fence rail was conquered or surrendered to, a new challenge often took its place. A different kind of game, quieter but no less thrilling. One that required not strength or speed, but stillness, timing, cleverness. In the medieval village, where open spaces were rare and shadows plentiful, the game of hiding and finding was more than a simple pastime. It was a ritual of movement and silence, played in barns, behind bakehouses, between hedgerows and within the folds of daily life. There were no formal rules, no counting with eyes closed against a tree, though that might happen too. Instead, it was often a fluid game, one that began without announcement and ended only when someone was caught, discovered, or called in for supper. Barns were among the best places, full of corners and lofts, beams and barrels, bales of hay stacked just unevenly enough to offer crevices and hiding spots for small, determined bodies. The dry straw crackled underfoot. Dust motes hung in sunbeams like golden mist. Every rustle could give you away, and every silence felt earned. To hide well was to understand your surroundings intimately, to know which pile of feed sacks hadn't been touched in days, which blanket was draped just right to conceal a crouching shape, which side of the ladder the shadows favoured as the sun moved across the open doorway. The best hiders moved slowly, deliberately, even barefoot, to avoid squeaking wood or shifting hay. And to seek well, that was an art too. It meant thinking like a sibling, predicting their hiding spots based on last time, or guessing which part of the barn they'd been glancing at before the game began. Some seekers leapt out dramatically, lifting hay bundles and shouting. Others moved softly, trying to catch a breath, a giggle, a flicker of movement. It was not always fair. Some children were simply better at vanishing, smaller, quieter, better at holding their breath in a pile of old cloaks. Others couldn't help but betray themselves, peeking out too early, sneezing from dust, or losing patience and bursting from their hiding spot in a fit of laughter. But the joy wasn't in the winning. It was in the drama of the search, the suspense of footsteps drawing near, the thrill of slipping past the seeker unnoticed. A barn, after all, was never just a barn. In the mind of a child, it was a labyrinth, a fortress, a cathedral of hiding places with lofts and ladders and trapdoors to be discovered anew each time. There were dangers, of course, loose boards, rusted nails, the occasional irritated rooster. But the risks were known, and for most children, they were worth the cost. Scraped knees and straw in the hair were badges of success. Sometimes the seeker gave up before all were found, and the best hiders emerged only when hunger or boredom won out, smiling smugly, already planning where to hide next time. Beyond the barn, the village itself offered a larger canvas. Children hid beneath market stalls, behind laundry lines, in the narrow gaps between sheds. They tucked themselves beneath wagons, behind oven sheds, even in dry ditches. Some of the older children took pride in choosing near-impossible hiding spots. High rafters, crawl spaces, places so unlikely they remained undiscovered until someone worried aloud and an adult got involved. And yet, despite its mischief, hide and seek taught things. How to wait, how to watch, how to think like someone else, how to stay still even when your heart pounded with the thrill of being nearly caught. It was a kind of apprenticeship, not for farming or spinning, but for patience and strategy. Even the grown-ups seemed to respect it in their way. A father entering the barn might pause, glance around, and smile faintly as he spotted a small foot sticking out from under a saddlecloth. A mother might call a name softly, knowing her daughter was likely curled behind the stacked firewood, stifling a giggle. Eventually, the game would end. A hiding place would be revealed. A seeker would grow tired, or a voice would call from the lane, time for chores, or supper or bed. One by one, the children would emerge, dusted with hay, flushed with warmth, sometimes still half hidden in their thoughts. Next, we'll slip into the chill of winter and see how these same children turned frozen ponds into their playgrounds, sliding, skating and slipping through a season that didn't stop the fun, only reshaped it. But for now, imagine the soft rustle of straw, the creak of a barn door, the hush before discovery. And somewhere in the shadows, a child holds their breath and smiles. But shadows shift with the seasons. The bright fields of summer turn pale with frost. The hay-scented warmth of the barn gives way to a chill that slips through walls and settles into bone. Yet even then, even in winter, children still played. because when the ponds froze and the ground turned to stone, the games did not stop. They simply changed. The fields lay silent, the hedges bare, but beneath the pale sun or a sky heavy with snow, a new kind of playground emerged: ice. To a medieval child, a frozen pond was a marvel, not just for its smooth, strange hardness, but for the movement it allowed. A slipperiness that turned every step into a gamble, and every fall into a fit of laughter. With no knowledge of safety rails or indoor rinks, they stepped boldly onto the surface, testing it with cautious feet, then sliding awkwardly, clumsily, joyfully across the glassy expanse. Some simply ran and slipped again and again, spinning and tumbling like sacks of grain knocked from a cart. Others crouched low, pushing with hands and knees, giggling as they glided forward. But the boldest, and often the eldest, came equipped with skates made of bone, fashioned from the leg bones of cattle or horses. These primitive skates were strapped to boots or tied beneath thick woolen socks with leather cords. With a stout stick in hand, the child would push themselves across the ice, propelling forward in jerky rhythm. There was no grace in it, but there was delight. A good slide meant distance, a fall meant noise, and either outcome was greeted with cheers. The skates made a rasping sound, soft and eerie, as they scraped the surface. Some children raced, others chased. A few made games of tag across the ice, though this led to more falling than catching. But it hardly mattered. The cold pinched their cheeks red and stung their noses, but their laughter steamed in the air, louder than the wind. Ponds were the best, especially those near the edge of the village, where trees leaned over the banks and created natural boundaries. Some places had streams that froze in narrow ribbons, curving through the fields. These were more dangerous, with thinner ice and faster water underneath, but that only added to the allure. Children dared each other to cross, to test, to skate along the icy snake of water while others watched wide-eyed. Falls were common, so were bruises. A tunic soaked with half-thawed snow was not pleasant in the long chill of a medieval winter. But few children cared. They dried by the fire later, stiff-limbed and smiling. To slip, to fall, to clamber back up laughing, that was part of the game. Even the surrounding snow became a tool for play. Children scooped it up in handfuls, packed it into crude balls, or shaped it into creatures with pebbles for eyes. There were no carrots for noses, no coal for buttons, but there were sticks, stones and scraps. A small snow goat, a towering snow priest, a rabbit curled from drifts and decorated with leaves. These sculptures stood for a day or two, slowly softening, then vanished with the sun. Sleds too appeared, often nothing more than upturned barrels or planks of wood tied together. Children climbed hills, pushed off with shrieks, and tumbled in heaps at the bottom. They used cloaks, trays, broken baskets, whatever slid. There was no sledge shop, no waiting for gifts, just invention and momentum and joy. And when the light began to fade and the cold grew sharper, they wandered home, faces red and fingers aching, boots stiff with ice. The silence of winter returned to the pond, but the tracks, scratched lines, footprints, slides, remained for a while, a quiet testimony to the games that had come and gone. In the next part of our journey, we'll step inside, into fire-warmed rooms and smoky corners to explore the quiet joy of indoor games by firelight. Because when the wind howled outside and the dark pressed close to the shutters, play took on a softer rhythm. Riddles, rhymes and whispered dares passed from child to child in the flickering glow. But for now, imagine a pond ringed with frost, a child pushing off with a sharpened bone, arms outstretched, hair flying, and a shout of triumph echoing into the winter sky. It was rarely the only shout, because once the pond had been skated, once the hills had been slid, and once the snow had packed just right beneath boots and mittens, a new kind of play began. Louder, wilder, more competitive. The kind of game that drew spectators from doorways and sent crows scattering from nearby branches. Snow battles. In the heart of a medieval winter, when snow blanketed the village paths and drifted against the fences, children didn't just trudge through it, they built with it, fought in it, transformed it into a battlefield shaped by imagination and frozen fingers. The game always started the same way. A single snowball, hastily packed and thrown with a grin, a yelp, a chase, and suddenly the whole village square became a field of war, though no one ever called it that. They called it a game. But it had tactics, alliances, betrayals, victory, defeat, children rushed to form sides, gathering friends or siblings, choosing leaders and quickly claiming territory. The best forts were built fast, walls formed from packed snow thick and crouch high, sometimes reinforced with sticks or stones at the base for stability. If they had time, they carved notches for throwing snowballs. If not, they just dove behind drifts and shouted for reinforcements. There were rules of a sort. No snowballs with rocks inside, no aiming for eyes. But the rest? Fair game. Ambushes, feints, brave charges. Children crawled through bushes and ducked behind haycarts. They shrieked as snowballs thudded against cloaks and tunics, the powder exploding like puffed flour. Laughter echoed through the cold air, mixing with war cries shouted in tiny voices, bold and breathless. The snowballs themselves varied. Some were loose and crumbling, scattering harmlessly in midair. Others were packed tight by experienced hands, held in reserve for a decisive strike. Some children made stockpiles behind their fort walls, small white arsenals ready to be hurled over the top like the stones of a miniature siege. There was no prize, no formal ending. Battles dissolved as fingers grew numb and noses turned red. Eventually someone cried out from a doorstep that it was time to come inside. One team might claim victory, or everyone might forget who had been winning. It didn't matter. The important part had already happened. The clash, the chase, the cold on their cheeks, the joy in their breath. And when snow was scarce, or the drifts too soft to pack well, the children got creative. They lobbed handfuls of powder like smoke bombs. They threw imaginary snowballs, acting out hits with theatrical flops. The game itself was what mattered, not the tools. Pretend snow was better than no snow at all. Sometimes older siblings joined. Teenagers, tall and fast, with stronger arms and louder laughs. Their arrival often turned the tide of a battle, or made the younger ones scatter in delighted panic. Occasionally, an adult would play, just for a minute, tossing a half-hearted snowball at the child's back while pretending not to have started it. These rare moments were treasured, retold in whispers later that night. "Did you see Father? He hit Will square in the ear!" Some forts lasted days. Children returned to them again and again, patching their walls, building them higher, carving initials into the packed surfaces. They became castles or caves or command posts. In some villages, entire rows of snow huts were built, little colonies that vanished slowly under the weight of the sun. Others took the battle beyond the village, into woods or along frozen stream banks, where surprise was easier and the forts could be hidden. There, away from the eyes of adults, the games took on an even wilder shape. Secret passwords, captured prisoners, negotiated peace, broken promises, last-minute rescues. Yet through all the shouting, the rushing, the snow flung high into the air like flour from a sack, there was something tender beneath it all. These were children learning bravery, loyalty, humour, endurance, and above all, joy in the cold. When the battles ended, their hands were raw and stiff, their knees wet, their teeth chattering behind wild grins. They returned to doorways trailing snow, shoes heavy and dripping, faces red with cold and laughter. The snow would melt, the forts would sag and vanish. But for that afternoon, the world had been theirs to conquer. Next, we'll head indoors, where the chill gave way to flickering hearths, and fun took a quieter shape. Games by firelight, where riddles and rhymes replaced snowballs, and the shadows danced along the stone walls. But for now, picture a snow-packed hill, a crooked white fort, and a child half buried in powder, laughing as another snowball sails through the air. But even laughter has its limit in the cold. Eventually, fingers lose feeling, boots soak through, and the call of a glowing hearth becomes louder than any shout on the battlefield. The snow forts are abandoned, the drifts are left untouched, and one by one, children retreat indoors, shaking off the cold, red-cheeked and breathless, leaving trails of melting footprints across wooden floors. Inside, the world was smaller but no less magical. The fire burned low, a dull orange glow beneath soot-darkened pots. Shadows stretched long against the walls. A kettle simmered. A dog dozed. And in these quiet hours between supper and sleep, another kind of play unfolded. A softer kind. The kind lit not by sunlight, but by firelight. In the dim warmth of the family hearth, children gathered close. There wasn't much space and even less room for running, but where bodies stilled, imaginations stirred. Here in the glow of the embers, fun took the form of riddles, rhymes, quiet challenges, and the comfort of shared stories. Riddles were a favourite, sometimes passed down from older siblings, sometimes invented on the spot. What has legs but cannot walk? What grows longer as the night grows shorter? The answers were guessed and argued over, laughed at or praised. These weren't just games, they were exercises in cleverness, in observation, in the twist of words. Even the youngest children would try, offering riddles with no real answers, proud just to be part of the game. Rhymes came next. Hand-clapping chants, often whispered rather than shouted, with strange old verses passed along like heirlooms. Some rhymes had meaning, others were nonsense, a string of sounds that made children giggle or furrow their brows in concentration as they tried to repeat them without mistake. They sat cross-legged on the floor or leaned against a parent's leg, clapping hands in rhythm with a sibling or friend. And sometimes it wasn't a rhyme or riddle, but a memory game. A challenge to recall every item in a basket, or every animal someone named in a long, winding list. I saw a fox, a goat, a goose, a lamb, each child adding one more, until someone slipped and had to start again. These were games with no prizes, only pride. The kind of games that drew in everyone, slowly, until even the quietest child added their voice. There were object games too. Little contests using whatever was close at hand, a piece of string, a carved bone, a smooth pebble, a coin if the family had one. Children would toss them, pass them, guess which hand held them. The flick of fingers, the curl of a palm. These movements became the entire world for a few minutes at a time. Even stories, when told properly, became games. A parent or elder might begin a tale, pausing partway through. And then what do you think he did? The children took turns guessing. Some answers were wild, dragons, magic, treasure. Others were thoughtful. A poor man sharing his bread, a lost girl finding her way home. The endings didn't need to be correct. They just needed to be imagined. Sometimes older children performed small plays. Nothing rehearsed, nothing grand, just mimicry. An imitation of the village priest's booming voice or the baker's impatient muttering. They borrowed lines from sermons, from folk tales, from overheard gossip. Everyone laughed when a child stood straight and pretended to scold the family goose for not attending church. The firelight made everything more dramatic. Shadows moved across the walls like silent characters of their own. And through it all, the fire flickered, the dog shifted in its sleep, the wind rattled the shutters. But inside there was a kind of peace that only comes from being warm, being safe and being together. These indoor games didn't leave marks on the ground like sled tracks or fort walls, but they left something just as lasting, a sense of belonging, a sense of voice, a rhythm of shared time that would echo into adulthood. Next, we'll step deeper into those evenings to explore family fun on long nights, where stories stretched out like quilts, lullabies were hummed beneath thick blankets, and the last games of the day gave way to dreams. But for now, picture a circle of children, cheeks flushed from the cold, palms red from clapping, voices rising and falling like the embers in the hearth. The snow waits outside, but inside there is only warmth and play. And when the clapping slowed, when the riddles had all been guessed, and the fire burned low to a quiet bed of coals, something else would settle over the room. A gentler hush, a slowing of voices. The laughter still lingered, but it softened, tucked in among wool blankets and straw-stuffed mattresses. It was evening, and in a medieval home, evening was a time not just for rest, but for togetherness. The long winter nights seemed to stretch forever, pressing dark against the walls long before supper had ended. Candles were precious, firewood even more so. But time? Time was plentiful, and so families leaned into it, filling the quiet hours with soft games, slow stories, and the kind of closeness that asked for no effort, only presence. Children curled beside parents or nestled in bunches on the floor, sharing cloaks and cushions. If someone was lucky enough to have a dog, it was pulled into the mix, snoring and warm at their feet. A mother mended clothes while humming old melodies. A father might sharpen a blade or pluck at a stringed instrument if one was owned, and around them the children watched or listened or joined in. Storytelling was the heart of it all. Not grand legends, though those had their place, but simpler tales, local ones. Stories of foolish travellers, clever girls who outwitted greedy lords, mischievous animals who stole bread and avoided blame. Some tales were funny, others sad, and some had no real ending at all. But they were told with rhythm, with pause, with voice, and with memory. Passed down like recipes, polished each time they were spoken aloud. The children didn't just listen, they participated. They asked questions, guessed endings, giggled when someone forgot a line or added a silly twist. Sometimes they requested the same tale night after night, savouring its familiarity like a warm bowl of porridge. And in that ritual, the repetition, the rhythm, the shared remembering, a kind of magic was formed. Music, too, if it could be made, wove its way into the night. Not always with instruments, though flutes and fiddles were known in wealthier homes, but with voices, little songs, rounds and lullabies, many without known origins, their words bent by generations. Children joined in as they could, humming or tapping fingers against their knees. No performance, no applause, just a sound to fill the space. There were hand games as well, especially for younger children not yet lulled to sleep, a gentle pat a cake or a finger-counting rhyme. Shadows cast on the wall, made into birds or wolves with flickering hands. Pebble games played by touch rather than sight, passed between children like secrets. These were games with no winners, no goal but to stay awake just a little longer, to linger in the warmth before the cold corners of the cottage called them to bed. Even the tasks of the evening, repairing socks, carding wool, plucking feathers, became background to these soft entertainments. Older children helped with quiet hands while their minds drifted through the stories being told. It was learning, but not as a lesson. It was play, but not as excitement. It was comfort, braided into motion. And when at last eyes began to droop and speech fell away, the fire was banked low and the family prepared for sleep. Blankets shared, hands held, final whispers in the dark. The night closed in outside, black and endless. But within those four walls there was warmth. Not just from fire, but from memory, from laughter, from being together. Tomorrow would bring work, wood to chop, water to fetch. But tonight there had been something else, a shared pause, where even in a world of labour and scarcity, joy was passed around like a story by firelight. Next we'll step outside again into a rougher kind of fun. The dangerous, daring games that children loved best. Mock battles, goat chases and climbing too high. Because not all medieval fun was gentle. Some of it carried bruises. But for now, imagine a child asleep. One arm around a sibling, the other resting where a warm dog once lay, a fire's last glow on the ceiling, and the echo of a rhyme, half remembered, still drifting in their dreams. Dreams, often, of bravery, of dragons fought off with kitchen ladles, of castles defended from imaginary invaders, of swords raised high, wooden and worn, but no less mighty in a child's hand. Because while quiet games and gentle songs filled the evenings, there was another kind of play waiting in the brighter hours, a kind that stirred the blood and quickened the breath. Mock battles. In the soft light of morning or the open stretch of afternoon, once chores were done or parents were distracted, children across the medieval world reached for their wooden weapons. Not the finely carved practice blades of noble sons, but simple, found things, branches, firewood scraps, fence posts or broom handles whittled down to something roughly sword-shaped. And with a sword came a story. No child simply held a stick. They wielded it, named it, declared themselves knight or outlaw, defender of their cottage or conqueror of the next field over. Girls and boys alike joined these games, though some might claim otherwise after the bruises were counted. In these mock battles, everyone had a role, and the fight itself was more important than the reason behind it. The battlefield was usually wherever they were not supposed to be, behind the barn, along the edge of the field, in the ruins of an old wall or the shadowed clearing just past the hedgerow, somewhere they wouldn't knock over the laundry or trip a passing adult. And if they were caught mid-duel, flushed and defiant, the excuse was always the same: we're just playing. And they were. But it was serious play. They faced off with sticks held in both hands, swinging in arcs that were sometimes graceful, often clumsy, and occasionally too close for comfort. There were rules, but only loosely followed. No hits to the head, no swinging when someone's not ready. If you drop your sword, you're out. These rules were flexible, rewritten with every round. Fights were won not only with skill, but with loudness, drama, and bravado. A child who tumbled theatrically to the ground, moaning as if mortally wounded, might earn more respect than one who simply declared victory. Wounds were announced with great flair. "You've cut off my arm." You stabbed my knee. I'm bleeding from the neck, followed by exaggerated limps, crawls, or resurrection if no one was looking. Some children made shields from flat boards or old basket lids. Others tied cloth around their arms as armour, or painted mud across their faces for war paint. A flower crown could be a helmet. A turnip stalk, a lance. Their gear was absurd, and yet in their minds it was all real. Occasionally these battles turned. A swing hit too hard, a knuckle got scraped, a stick broke mid-strike and splintered into a hand. There were tears, sometimes blood, and the immediate tension of whether to continue or call it off. But most of the time the game resumed, slower at first, then louder, until the rhythm of attack and defence took hold again. These mock battles were more than play. They were rehearsals, not for war exactly, but for courage, for endurance, for timing and trust. A child learned when to swing and when to dodge, when to bluff and when to yield. They learned, too, how to apologise when things went too far, and how to laugh when they lost. In some villages, older children organised tournaments, teams were formed, rules were posted, verbally at least. A patch of land was declared a tournament ground, and spectators, mostly younger children, gathered to watch. Flags were made of torn cloth. A winner was crowned with a wreath of weeds. The defeated were promised revenge tomorrow, and all of it washed away in the fading light of day. The adults watched warily. A sharp eye from a doorway, a shouted warning if the swings came too close to the chickens, but they rarely stopped it altogether. After all, their fathers had fought with sticks. Their daughters had duelled with brooms. The scars on their own knees were reminders that pretend battles taught lessons real ones never could. Next, we'll slip from the battlefield into the goat pen, where play became mischievous, unpredictable, and often involved more bleating than bravery. Because sometimes the most dangerous fun came with 4 legs and a pair of tiny stubborn horns. But for now, picture a child standing in a patch of trampled grass, gripping a branch like a sword, chest heaving, eyes shining, and smiling like they'd just won a kingdom. But victory wasn't always found in pretend battle. Sometimes it was claimed in altitude, in going just a little higher than the others dared, in perching on a rafter, a branch, a crumbling stone wall, arms spread wide, heart pounding from the sheer danger of it. Because for many medieval children, one of the boldest, most thrilling ways to play was simply this: climbing too high. The village offered endless opportunities. Low thatched cottages with sloped roofs, barns with exposed beams, trees with gnarled limbs bent low and strong, old stone ruins with half-toppled walls, their edges softened by moss and time. Every surface became a ladder if you were determined enough, and many children were. It usually began innocently. A chase led to a wall. A game of lookout led to the roof of the chicken coop. But very quickly the climb became the point. To reach a spot no one else had. To wave from above and hear the gasps. To sit, legs swinging, above the world that always told you where you could and could not go. Up there, no one could tell you to sweep the floor. The easiest climbs were fences and hay bales, stacked high and loose. Trickier were the trees, branches slick with rain or resin, bark rough enough to scratch, but good for gripping. Children learned quickly which trees were friendly. The plum trees bent low and offered easy climbs. The tall oaks were harder but more rewarding, their crowns giving the illusion of total escape. Some children climbed with purpose, to spy, to plan, to play at being the lookout in a band of thieves. Others climbed to think, to be alone, to escape squabbling siblings or a long list of chores. A rafter beam in the barn became a fortress of solitude. A perch in the tree became a ship's mast or a king's tower. Height was power and peace. But it was not without risk. Scraped elbows and skinned knees were common, accepted, even expected. Tunics tore, splinters embedded in palms. Occasionally someone slipped, a branch broke, a foot missed its mark. The fall was short, usually, just enough to bruise, but sometimes it was worse. A twisted ankle, a wrist that didn't quite heal straight. Children bore these marks like quiet badges. If you asked them, it was worth it. The adults, well, they didn't always agree. A shout from the doorway. A scolding from the foot of the tree. "You'll break your neck! Get down before you kill yourself!" But the shouting only came after the climbing began, and more often than not, the scolding faded if no harm was done, because they remembered too, their own climbs, their own scraped shins and triumphant grins. In noble homes, climbing was discouraged, unladylike, undignified, unnecessary. But even there, children found ways. A younger son scaling the outer wall while the tutor shouted below. A lady's maid's daughter climbing trees at the edge of the orchard, laughing behind her hand. The desire to climb, to see the world from a new angle, respected no class boundaries. Some children climbed to prove something, to older siblings, to friends, to themselves. Bet you can't make it to the top. I've been higher than that. I can stand without holding on. The challenge was spoken, the risk understood, and still they went, barefoot or in worn shoes, gripping branches or roof thatch, hair whipping in the wind. And once they reached the top, be it barn, tree or crumbling stone, they stayed a moment, breathing, looking, smiling. Because from up there the village looked different, smaller, softer, as if for a moment the child no longer belonged to it but instead looked down on it like a bird, free and weightless. Eventually, of course, they climbed down. Carefully, slowly, or in a rush when they realised they'd gone too far. The ground welcomed them again, sometimes gently, sometimes not. Next, we'll chase that thrill across the fields, where animals became unexpected playmates in goat chasing and chicken races, games that were noisy, unplanned, and full of mischief. But for now, picture a child perched in the crook of a branch, eyes wide, knees dusty, grinning through the leaves. Somewhere below, a friend calls up in awe. And the sky feels a little closer, but eventually the child climbs down. The branch creaks, the boots scrape and feet return to earth. And what waits on the ground is not always peace, but mischief. Loud, restless, unpredictable mischief, often with a mind of its own and hooves to match. Because while many medieval games were crafted from imagination or borrowed from chores, some of the loudest laughter came from a kind of play that wasn't planned at all, chasing the animals. Every village had them, goats, chickens, pigs, geese, and while these creatures were meant for milk, eggs, meat or labour, they also became unwilling participants in childhood fun. Children didn't mean harm most of the time. They simply couldn't resist the comedy of a flapping hen or the wild sprint of a goat who'd had enough of being herded. The goats were the stars. Mischievous by nature, stubborn in spirit and fast on their feet, they made perfect but difficult playmates. A child would crouch in the field, hands out like a wrestler, eyes locked on the goat nibbling calmly a few feet away. "Just a bit closer," they'd whisper. "I'll grab him this time." And then off he went. A blur of hooves, a spray of dust, and a shriek of delighted failure. Sometimes it was a race, a game between children to see who could circle the goat pen 3 times without getting butted or knocked over. Other times the goal was simple: touch the goat's tail. A near impossible task that resulted in tangled tunics, scraped knees, and endless laughter. There was danger, of course. Goats didn't like being chased. They butted low, sharp, and fast. A child caught off guard might land flat on their back and blinking up at the sky with more surprise than pain. But still, they tried again and again, because the story afterward was always worth the bruise. "He almost got me in the stomach. I grabbed his horn. He climbed the pile of firewood, and I followed him." The chickens, too, were part of the chaos. Easier to catch, but harder to keep, they fluttered and flapped and scolded loudly as soon as a child came near. Children made games of it, lining up for chicken races, placing a hen on the ground, pointing her toward a finish line drawn in the dirt, and then clapping or shouting to startle her into motion. The rules were simple. Whichever child's chicken crossed the line first won. The prize? Bragging rights. Maybe the last bit of cheese, maybe nothing at all, but the game itself was prize enough. Children cheered, argued, swapped chickens, and accused each other of cheating. Sometimes the chickens didn't run at all, just stood there, blinking, refusing to play along. That too became part of the game. The pigs were slower, smellier, and far less cooperative. Most children avoided chasing them, unless dared to. But geese? Geese were something else entirely. Tall, sharp-eyed, territorial. The village goose was known by name and feared by every child who'd ever run from its snapping beak. Still, some brave soul would always try, a careful approach, a slow reach, and then the explosion. A flurry of wings, a furious honking, and a dozen children fleeing in all directions, laughing even as they screamed. These games had no beginnings, no endings. They started with a shout, a glance, a challenge. They ended when someone cried, when an adult shouted, or when the goat disappeared into a field too wide to follow. There were no trophies, only stories, and sometimes a scolding for spooking the livestock again. But in these noisy, muddy, unpredictable games, something joyful endured. Children learned speed. Caution, bravery. They learned how to fall and how to dodge. They learned, too, that not all fun came from quiet stories or careful crafts. Sometimes it came from chaos. And the animals? They endured it, tolerated it, maybe even understood, in their own way, that they were part of the rhythm of village life, not just as food or workers, but as characters in the daily theatre of childhood. Next, we'll turn to a quieter sort of daring, playing near rivers and wells, where the edge between safety and danger grew thin, and the thrill came from being just close enough to the line. But for now, picture a group of children in woolen tunics, faces flushed, arms outstretched, chasing a goat with wild eyes and nimble feet across the yard. Behind them a trail of laughter, the sky, watching it all unfold. But not all games were wild charges through the goat yard, or flurries of feathers and flapping wings. Some took place at the edges of the village, of the day, of safety itself, and none were closer to that line than the quiet, unsupervised games played near rivers and wells. Water, in the medieval world, was both precious and perilous. It was needed for everything, cooking, washing, soaking, brewing, but it was also unpredictable. A swollen stream could sweep a foot out from under you, a mossy bank could crumble in an instant. And yet, children still played there. Because where there was danger, there was also thrill. Where there was water, there was wonder. The village well was usually a central fixture. Heavy stone or wooden-framed, rope and bucket hanging in the middle, its edges worn smooth by generations of hands. It was a source of gossip, of routine, of life. But for children, it also became a quiet place of curiosity and a magnet for games. They dared each other to lean too far over the edge, not recklessly, but just enough. Can you see the bottom? Drop a pebble. How long till it hits? They whispered stories about what lived down there. Monsters, spirits, sleeping dragons. One child might swear they'd seen glowing eyes. Another might insist they'd heard something breathe. These tales passed between them in hushed tones, growing more elaborate with each retelling. The bucket, when it was unattended, became a toy, turned upside down and rolled, climbed on like a barrel, or used as a prop in imaginary games. A knight, guarding the sacred well. A healer drawing water to save the queen, a prisoner in a tower. These small rituals were as familiar as the well itself, comforting even as they flirted with danger. Beyond the well, the streams and rivers offered a different kind of play. They were less predictable, more wild, sometimes shallow and skipping over stones, sometimes deep and slow, hiding their secrets in brown, cold silence. Children came to them barefoot, toes tingling in the icy water, testing the strength of the current with sticks. They built boats from bark, raced leaves downstream, or stood on stones to watch twigs spin in eddies. A plank of wood became a bridge, a challenge, walk across without falling in. A shallow bend in the river became a wading pool in warmer months, with pants rolled up to the knees and the occasional splash fight breaking out in between. But even as they played, they knew this was a place to be careful. Older children warned the younger ones, don't go too deep, don't run on wet rocks, don't climb the weir when it's been raining. These weren't rules from adults. They were wisdom passed child to child, earned through scraped shins and soaked tunics. Sometimes a tale of someone slipping or nearly drowning would circulate for weeks. And while it didn't stop the play, it wrapped it in a quiet sense of seriousness. There were moments of real fear, a sudden slip, a foot caught between rocks, a game too close to the edge, but even then the others would rally. Grab a hand. Shout for help, pull someone free. Because while these games skirted danger, they were never played alone. And the water gave back too. It taught things, the rhythm of the current, the sound of water over stones, how a stick moves when you let it go, how a pebble skips, how light dances in ripples. It was a place of learning, not with words, but with senses, with skin and breath and instinct. The grown-ups knew, of course. They warned and watched, but they didn't always forbid. Perhaps they understood that a child who learned the limits of water through play would grow into an adult who respected it, Perhaps they remembered their own childhood, standing on the same stones, chasing the same ripples. Next, we'll return to the heart of the village to explore the group games and village-wide fun that brought children together, games of tug and circle, call and response, and everything in between. But for now, picture the edge of a quiet stream. A child crouched, eyes following a leaf drifting slowly past, the water cold, the air still. And in that moment, play and peace were one and the same. But not all games were quiet. Not all were solitary. Just as some children sought the hush of streams or the mystery of the well, others were drawn to the noise of togetherness, the pull, the tumble, the song, the chase that only made sense when a dozen voices joined at once. Because in every medieval village, no matter how small, there came a time, usually late afternoon, when chores were winding down, or during seasonal feasts or after Sunday prayers, when children gathered for group games. These were the loudest, liveliest moments of play, the ones where the whole village green became a blur of movement, dust, and shrieking laughter. One of the oldest and simplest games, known in many forms across time, was tug-of-war, though it likely had no name back then. Just a rope, or even a length of linen, something thick enough to hold, long enough to stretch, and sturdy enough not to snap on the first pull. Teams were chosen quickly, often unevenly, with a flurry of shouts and finger-pointing. You're with me. No, she's too strong, we want her. The goal was simple. Pull hard, pull until the other side tumbles into the dust. Feet planted, bodies leaning, teeth gritted in effort. They pulled as if it mattered. And in a way, it did. It was strength, yes, but also timing. Coordination, trust. The smallest child might tip the balance by anchoring at the right moment, a sudden give in the rope, a slip in the back line, and the whole team would collapse in a heap, shouting, laughing, groaning. There were no prizes, no trophies, just the joy of effort and collapse, of dirt-streaked faces, rope-burned palms, and aching arms. The game might end or it might start again, with new teams, new rules, new dares. Sometimes they played across a puddle or a line of scattered straw. Sometimes they played just to settle a bet, boys against girls, young against old, north side of the lane against south. It was all in good fun, or mostly so. Then came the circle games, more rhythmic, more communal, less about force and more about feeling. Children formed rings, holding hands loosely or tightly, skipping in time, spinning in dizzy loops, singing verses that had been sung so many times no one remembered who'd first spoken them. Some were simple rhymes, others were nonsense syllables handed down from older siblings. Round and round the barley sheaves, turn until the daylight leaves. The lyrics changed from village to village. Sometimes they made sense. Sometimes they were just words, chosen for how they sounded rather than what they meant. But always they carried rhythm, a heartbeat for the game to follow. In some circles, one child stood in the middle and was chosen, gently shoved, pointed at, clapped around, until they picked a partner or acted out a part. The shepherd, the fox, the bride, the thief. The child in the centre never stayed long. The circle turned again, the chant resumed, and another took their place. These games required little space and no objects, just bodies, voices, shared memory. They could be played in a corner of the green, on the dirt path near the church, even inside a barn if the rain came down too hard. The magic wasn't in the place, it was in the movement, the shared rhythm, the echo of many feet in time with many voices. Sometimes the games got faster, the circle spun quicker, the words came louder, until someone tripped or laughed too hard to keep going, and the ring broke apart in joyful chaos. Other times that the game slowed down to near stillness, as if preparing everyone for the moment when they would let go of each other's hands and drift quietly into whatever came next. And when dusk settled over the village and the last circle broke, the children scattered, some home for supper, some to fetch water, some called back to finish a half-done task. But for a while they had been one thing, a unit, a rhythm, a shared pulse of motion and sound. Next, we'll explore the seasonal frolics that brought entire villages together, games and dances bound to springtime, harvest, and holy days, when the line between child's play and festival blurred beneath garlands and sun. But for now, picture a ring of children, their hands clasped, feet shuffling, voices rising in uneven harmony. The dust of the day hangs in the air, and above them, the last golden light slips over the rooftops, gentle like a lullaby. Some games were meant to blaze bright, loud, and full of joy beneath open skies and ringing bells. Because in the medieval world, the calendar itself was a source of play, a rhythm of holy days, planting times, and harvest feasts that pulled children into the heart of celebration. These were seasonal frolics, and they were different from the daily games whispered between chores or shouted behind barns. They belonged to the whole village. And, for a child, they were unforgettable. In the springtime, when the ground softened and buds unfurled, a restless energy took hold. The long winter was over, the sun returned, and with it came festivals of renewal, often marked by garlands, ribbons, music and dancing that spilled into every open space. Children, like the grown-ups, wore their best or their cleanest. Tunics scrubbed and mended, hair braided with wildflowers or tied back with bits of coloured thread. They were not spectators, they were participants. When the village gathered on May Day or Easter Monday, children danced too, not in straight lines or perfect time, but in wild, weaving loops of joy. One of the oldest spring games involved chasing and catching, not just ordinary tag, but games with names like the garland chase or the flower thief, where one child wore a crown of blossoms and the others tried to steal it without being caught. The games looped around village greens, between grazing sheep, through the shadows of blooming orchards. Laughter carried on the breeze. Rules were made and broken. Someone always cried, someone always laughed harder. Later in the year, as the fields gave up their grain and the apples sweetened in the trees, came the harvest celebrations. These were among the most important moments in the village year, and not just for food and prayer. They were times of release, relief, and reward. The work was hard, but once done, the people played. Children watched the grown-ups build harvest carts, decorate them with ribbons and stalks of wheat. Some were invited to help. Others sneaked garlands from the edges and made crowns of their own. There were processions, and wherever there were processions, there were games tucked in between the steps, little dashes, balancing acts, moments of playful mimicry. In some villages, harvest time meant group dances, where everyone, young and old, joined in a circle that expanded until it included the entire green. The music might come from a drum, a fiddle, or simply clapping hands. The steps were simple, side to side, turn and jump. Nothing formal, nothing rehearsed, but the rhythm was infectious and even the smallest children caught it in their feet. There were contests too, not official ones, not with prizes, but with pride. Who could carry the biggest turnip? Who could jump the farthest from the hay bale? Who could stay balanced longest on the edge of the water trough? These were tests of strength and silliness, and they almost always ended in someone falling, laughing, or both. And at dusk, when the lanterns were lit and the feast spread across rough-hewn tables, the children didn't fall silent. They wandered between grown-up legs, snuck bites of bread and cheese, and played games in the flickering dark. Hide-and-seek among hay carts, riddles whispered under benches, songs half-sung from the edge of the firelight. These seasonal frolics weren't everyday occurrences. They were highlights in the year's long story, bookmarks in the routine of chores and rain and growing things. They reminded children that life was more than labour, that the village could dance, could laugh, could play, and that they belonged inside that joy. And perhaps most beautiful of all, they reminded the adults too. Next, we'll explore the call and response games, the songs that echoed through fields and chores, where memory and rhythm met in shared sound, binding children together with verses half ancient, half invented on the spot. But for now, picture a child with wildflower petals in their hair, cheeks flushed from dancing, twirling in a circle while grown-ups clap in time. The sky above is full of stars. The fields beyond are quiet. And for one perfect evening, the whole world seems to play along. But even when the festival lanterns dimmed and the garlands faded, the songs did not. Singing games were part of daily life, just as much as bread, water, and the dirt beneath a child's feet. Whether in the heat of a summer afternoon or the cool hush of an autumn morning, the sound of children's voices, bright, uneven, and full of mischief, often rose from fields, lanes, or village greens. Some of these songs were little more than chants, simple verses repeated in rounds until they stuck in everyone's head. A line about a miller grinding flour, a verse about the fox in the henhouse, a tune borrowed from a church hymn but twisted into something playful, The words didn't have to make sense, they simply had to carry rhythm. Children gathered in loose circles, clapping hands to set the beat. The verses began softly, often led by the oldest child, and grew louder as the game took hold. Sometimes each verse ended with a dare, turn around, or run to the tree, sending the children spinning or sprinting before they returned, laughing, to the circle. Call and response games were another favourite. One child would sing or shout a line, "Who stole the bread from the baker's shelf?" And the others would answer in chorus, naming someone else. The accused would deny it, feign outrage, and pass the blame. The game would spiral with shouts and giggles until the verses dissolved into chaos. No one ever won. Winning wasn't the point. The fun lived in the noise, the accusations, the back-and-forth rhythm that seemed to stretch time. Sometimes these singing rounds grew into bigger performances, a pretend court, with one child acting as judge, others as thieves or bakers. Accusations were sung. Sentences were playful. "Run 3 times around the well! Dance like a goose!" It was theatre, built from melody and mischief, and the audience was always ready to join. The songs themselves carried history. Some were older than anyone could remember, sung by parents and grandparents before them. Others were made up on the spot, lasting only for the afternoon, before being replaced by something new. But always the songs were communal threads, weaving the children together, even across ages or moods. Singing games also spilled into work. A group of siblings sent to gather firewood might sing to pass the time, turning the chore into something lighter. A nonsense verse, but it made the task less dull. The rhythm helped their steps, the rhyme filled the silence. Even weeding in the fields became easier when there was a song to keep count or lift spirits. In the evenings, after supper, these singing rounds often continued in smaller groups. 2 or 3 children, huddled near the hearth, might hum a song while tracing patterns in the ashes or tapping sticks in rhythm. A sister would stir us, a brother would answer with a silly rhyme. The parents, though tired, would often listen quietly, perhaps smiling at the echoes of their own childhoods hidden in those tunes. Some games required movement too, a line dance, a stepping game, or skipping in time with the verse. Others were played sitting still, with clapping hands or quick slaps of the knees. The simpler the rules, the better, because the real focus was on the shared sound, the feeling of many voices weaving together like threads of a single song. These call and response games had a special kind of magic in the open air. On warm days, the sound carried across the fields, where even adults working in the distance could hear it. The voices rose and fell like the wind. It made the village feel alive, not just with chores and labour, but with joy, a joy made from nothing but air and breath. Next, we'll step into the dynamics of those voices, where older children and younger ones often clashed or operated. Big kids versus little ones, and how these playful rivalries shaped the games themselves. But for now, picture a ring of children, clapping and laughing, voices overlapping, as the last line of their song fades into the open sky. For a moment, it is just them, the song, and the simple joy of being heard. The chorus didn't always stay harmonious. In every village, in every generation, a quiet line was drawn, not with chalk or rope, but with years. The big kids and the little ones. Taller tunics versus shorter strides. Broader shoulders versus grubby cheeks. And though they shared the same muddy lanes and mossy fences, their play often split along those invisible lines. The older children, perhaps 10 or 12, weren't quite adults, but they weren't far off. Their chores had sharpened, their voices deepened. They hauled firewood without help now, milked goats, carried buckets without spilling. But even as they grew stronger, they hadn't let go of play. Far from it. Instead, they refined it, ruled it, and, if asked, believed they perfected it. The younger ones? They were still new to the world of games, still clumsy in the fields, still prone to crying when scraped, and so in the eyes of their older peers, they were both adorable and annoying. Followers who mimicked, disrupted, slowed the pace. Shadows who always wanted in but rarely kept up. This divide led to a familiar rhythm. Rivalry, then teaching, then rivalry again. In games like Fox and Geese or Wolf in the Fold, big kids would take the lead, literally. They played the fox, the wolf, the one everyone else had to chase or run from. Their strides were longer, their tricks clever. They bent the rules mid-game and dared anyone to challenge them, but the little ones watched, always watching, and slowly, game by game, they learned. Not just how to play, but how to twist rules themselves, how to dodge behind trees, how to shout at the right moment, how to take a tumble and rise laughing. Sometimes the big kids noticed and smiled, other times they growled and shooed them away. You're too small. You don't get it. Go play your own game. Still, the little ones came back, because even rejection held a kind of lesson. To be allowed in was to be acknowledged. And on the best days, those golden, unexpected ones, the age line blurred. A big kid might offer a boost up a tree, a hand in a tug of war, a whisper of the next hiding place in a village-wide game. These were gifts, and the younger children treasured them. Teaching moments happened often. When a rope was too thick to manage alone, an older sibling might guide a smaller hand. When a chance rhythm was just out of reach, the verse was repeated until it stuck. Older girls might show how to braid flower stems. Older boys might teach a clever way to spin while skipping. These weren't lessons spoken from authority. They were offerings of experience, shared in the moment without a thought to legacy. And when the roles flipped, when a younger child surprised the group with a fast sprint or clever hiding spot, respect shifted slightly. The line moved. The gap closed. For a day, perhaps, the little one wasn't so little. Of course, the rivalry never vanished entirely. There were games where the age divide became the very point. Bigs versus littles, teams drawn by height, a race across the green, a wrestling match in the straw. The outcome often favoured the older group, but not always. Youth had its advantages: quickness, small spaces, untapped reserves of energy. When the little ones won, the cheers were twice as loud. Sometimes tensions boiled, a shove too hard, a joke that stung. And for a moment, the game would crack into argument, but rarely for long. A shared song would start, a fresh dare would distract, someone would laugh too hard, and the game would begin again. Because in the end, the village raised them all together. Whether 5 or 15, they knew the same fields, sang the same songs, dodged the same angry goose, and no matter the gaps in height or strength or skill, they belonged to the same muddy, joyful world. Next, we'll explore how fun met the natural world. Hollow logs turned into drums, icy ponds into skating rinks, and fields of wildflowers into stages for impromptu plays. But for now, picture 2 children, one tall, one small, laughing breathlessly after a game of tag, their hands on their knees, their smiles wide. For this moment, there is no age between them, only the game and the bond it forged. Across the river, or perhaps just up the road behind stone walls and wooden gates, the games looked a little different. The children of the manor house, born to lords and ladies rather than ploughmen and milkmaids, played too, but their playthings came carved and crafted, not cobbled from twigs and twine. Where peasant children mimicked battle with stick swords and clumps of mud, noble children often held something finer in their hands, wooden knights and horses, shaped by adult hands with time to spare and tools to work. These toys weren't always elaborate, but they bore a different purpose. They weren't just fun, they were practice for the roles those children were expected to grow into. For boys especially, toy knights were more than figures. They were symbols of identity. A young noble might receive a small horse, its legs straight, its painted saddle stiff with dried colour. Alongside it, a knight no taller than a hand, helmet carved with care, sword raised mid-strike. These tiny warriors were arranged on rugs, marched through dust and crashed into imaginary foes. Sometimes they were lined up on windowsills or shelves, admired like soldiers in formation. And yet for all their polish, they ended up nicked, worn, dirtied, just like any other toy. After all, even noble boys crawled on floors, muttered battle cries, and imagined dragons waiting beneath chairs. In that sense, childhood was shared, even if the trappings looked different. The horses were prized above all. Some were simple blocks on wheels, pulled with strings through the hallways. Others had carved manes and tails, even tiny bridles fashioned from scraps of leather. If a boy was lucky, or favoured, he might be gifted a hobby horse, a carved head on a stick, ridden proudly through the courtyard like a charger into war. Girls in noble households weren't left out of these toys, though their play often mirrored what they were being trained to become. Managers of households, keepers of culture, guardians of grace. Their carved toys might include small kitchens, wooden dolls dressed in scraps of linen, or miniature spinning wheels that mimic the ones their mothers used. Still, boundaries weren't always firm. A noble girl might borrow her brother's knight and stage her own tale. A boy might use dolls to act out a feast or a siege. When the adults weren't looking, the rules of gender bent in favour of imagination. The wooden toys became characters: heroes, villains, jesters, queens. Their roles changed with each afternoon. These toys weren't tossed away lightly. Many were passed down from sibling to sibling, sometimes even kept for generations. A well-made wooden horse might ride again a decade later under the command of a younger brother. A doll's cradle could rock for a cousin's child. The toys bore marks of time: faded paint, worn edges, scratches from sharp little teeth, and they weren't always bought. In smaller manors or less wealthy households, the carpenter or steward might carve a toy in secret as a Yuletide gift or a birthday surprise. These were deeply personal, engraved with initials shaped to look like a favourite hound or hawk. Some were crude, others exquisite, but all were made with the same quiet care, a recognition that even noble children needed play. In rare cases, the line between toy and training tool blurred. A wooden sword might be light enough for a child, but made with the seriousness of a future squire. A small shield, painted with the family crest, hung proudly in a boy's chamber. These were playthings, but also preparation. Because while peasant children dreamed of knights, noble children were expected to become them. Still, in the quiet of the nursery or the shadow of the great hall, when no one was watching, both kinds of children, rich or poor, noble or common, talked to their toys. Gave them names, scolded them, laughed with them, lost them in straw piles, and found them days later beneath a bench. The joy of imagination knew no class. Next, we'll explore the shadow side of childhood fun, when jokes went too far, when dares turned risky, and when even the wildest game had to end with a scolding and a scraped knee. But for now, picture a polished wooden knight, his painted eyes long faded, resting beside a well-worn horse on the floor of a manor nursery. Outside, children's voices echo through the courtyard, but in here, the quiet story of play continues, carved in wood and warmed by time. Yet not every toy was made to resemble a knight or a horse. Some were simpler, humble objects of motion and sound, the kind that delighted without purpose, that spun or sang or whirled with the wind. These were the toys found in both manor and village alike. Spinning tops and whistles, small treasures, easily lost in straw, but just as easily remade. A spinning top, in the medieval world, could be fashioned from wood, bone, or even a smooth stone. The most common were turned on a lathe if one was available, or carved by hand with a small knife. Some were little more than rough cones, while others were artfully smoothed, balanced just so, their points sharpened with care to twirl longer on flat stone or packed earth. To a child, noble or peasant, it wasn't the craftsmanship that mattered. It was the moment when the top caught the ground just right, began to wobble, then levelled into a perfect blur, that soundless hum of movement, that racing, spinning dance that defied stillness. It was hypnotic, magical even. Sometimes children would race their tops, each taking a turn to spin and watching whose toy lasted longest before collapsing into a lazy tilt. There were tricks too, making it spin on a plate, atop a foot, or even across a board, tilted like a roof. Older children would boast of their precision. Younger ones would chase the tops as they wobbled away under stools and carts. Tops were cheap, easy to repair, and carried no expectations. There were no lessons to learn, no victory to earn, just the joy of movement, the thrill of balance, and the quiet pleasure of watching a handmade object defy gravity for a few precious seconds. Then there were whistles, instruments of mischief and melody alike. The simplest were made from hollow reeds, bone, or shaped bits of wood. A shepherd might carve one during idle hours, handing it off to a younger sibling or keeping it for himself. The sound wasn't always pretty, sometimes shrill, sometimes breathy, but it carried, and that made it powerful. Children used whistles to call one another from across the green, to signal the start of a game, to mimic birds, to tease the geese, which was always risky but too tempting to resist. A well-aimed whistle could send a flock honking and flapping in alarm, and a child running in the other direction with laughter bursting from their chest. There were rules, unspoken but clear. Don't whistle near the priest's window or too close to a sleeping baby or during evening prayers. But of course, these were the very times a mischievous child might press the whistle to their lips just to see what would happen. Some whistles were passed around, a prize borrowed, stolen or gifted from one child to another. Others were personal, worn on cords around the neck or tucked into tunics. A treasured whistle might even be named, especially if it had a particular quirk. A high warble, a duck-like squawk, a breathy sigh that sounded oddly like the old goat in the back paddock. Together, tops and whistles formed a kind of portable joy, easy to carry, easy to share. A child could crouch alone in the dust, spinning their top over and over, content in their solitude. Or they could run with friends, whistling warnings, spinning in tandem, falling into heaps of tangled limbs and laughter. And perhaps most beautiful of all, these toys bridged the gap between classes, ages, and villages. A noble child might whistle to their falcon, while a peasant child copied the same tone to call a dog. A top carved by a manor carpenter might look much like one whittled by a shepherd's knife. They were different in finish, perhaps, but not in function. In the end, it was the motion and the sound that mattered, the flick of a wrist, the breath through a reed, the wonder that something so small could feel so alive. Next, we'll explore how fun sometimes took a mischievous turn, in the form of dares, pranks and trouble that left bruises, broken pots and scoldings in their wake. But for now, imagine a child crouched in the dirt, lips pursed to a wooden whistle, eyes wide as their top spins one more time, perfectly balanced on a patch of sunlit stone. For just a moment, the whole world spins with them. Not all games required motion, nor noise. There were some that unfolded on a flat board or a bare patch of ground, quiet except for murmured strategy, light laughter, or the click of bone on wood. In these moments, play slowed down, inviting not the thrill of running, but the patience of turn-taking, the anticipation of the next lucky throw. And at the heart of these games were dice, tiny, powerful cubes that turned chance into ritual and mimicry into mastery. Dice in the medieval world were most often made from carved bone, antler, or wood. They were rough by modern standards, hand-etched, uneven, sometimes only vaguely cuboid, but they served their purpose. The six-sided die was common, but other shapes existed too, especially among wealthier households or near monastic schools where scholars enjoyed numerical diversions. For adults, dice were part of tavern life and gambling, often frowned upon by clergy who saw the games as a gateway to idleness and sin. But children? Children played with dice for different reasons. No coin changed hands, no ale was wagered. Instead, the fascination came from the click of the throw, the chase of a winning pattern, and the shared satisfaction of rules half remembered and half invented. Some of these games were taught by older siblings who had overheard the grown-ups. Others were simplified forms of more serious contests. A child might not understand the stakes of a gambling den, but they understood first to six or roll to climb the ladder. The games became kid-friendly variants with stakes like chores, turns, or the last bite of a honeyed oatcake. One popular pastime was a race-style game often played with buttons, seeds, or pebbles moved along chalk-drawn paths. The board might be scratched into wood, etched on a flat stone, or simply drawn with a stick in the dust. Children took turns rolling, their makeshift pieces hopping from square to square, skipping over traps or bad luck marks, or racing to reach the carved symbol of a crown or hearth. They called it many things: the journey, the pilgrimage, market chase, depending on the region and what stories lived in the village memory. Other games resembled early versions of what we now call checkers or backgammon. Children moved pieces according to simple rules, sometimes incorporating strategy, sometimes just delighted by the rhythm of the moves. Occasionally, older children introduced house rules. If you roll doubles, you skip ahead 2 spaces. If you land on someone else's piece, they go back to the start. The rules evolved with the group, and everyone had to agree, or the game dissolved into arguing and laughter. And in noble households, these games became more refined. A carved wooden board might sit on a bench near the fire, its squares filled with ivory counters or painted tokens. Here children were taught patience and calculation, even etiquette, how to wait one's turn, how to lose without sulking, how to read another's strategy. These were not just games, they were training in grace and composure, disguised as play. Monasteries, too, sometimes passed on board games to the children who wandered their grounds, especially those learning to read or chant. Simple counting games helped teach numeracy. Letter-matching boards trained the memory. A quiet afternoon spent sliding wooden pieces across a table might lead to a better grasp of Latin or Psalm 23. The learning was tucked gently inside the fun. And yet, despite the differences in material and setting, the essence remained the same. Children loved to compete, to guess, to roll the dice and see what fortune brings. They play to learn and learn by playing. Whether seated cross-legged in the dirt or upright in a cushioned chamber, their eyes watched the dice the same way. Hopeful, intense, delighted. When the dice scattered, one under a bench, another in a pile of straw, it was cause for a scramble, a shared joke, and the occasional household scolding. "Don't play inside," some mothers would sigh, "mind the hearth." But the dice returned all the same, slipped back into pockets or tied in scraps of cloth, little cubes of luck, clutched like treasure. Next, we'll explore the joys of festive noise-making and joke-telling when children stepped into the spotlight to make others laugh, or sometimes groan. But for now, imagine a group of children huddled around a board scratched into the earth, pebbles in hand, breath held as a die clatters and tumbles. No one knows what it will land on, but for a moment the whole world waits for it. And in that suspended moment, where chance ruled and imagination filled in the rest, another kind of play quietly took shape. One not based on running or tumbling or winning a race, but on pretending, mimicking what was just out of reach. For in nearly every peasant village behind hedgerows and past the edges of the lord's estate, children sometimes dared to play at something bigger than themselves. They played nobility. It might begin with a scrap of fabric, faded velvet from an old tunic, cast off from the manor house or bartered from a travelling peddler. To an adult, it was nothing. But to a child, it was a cape, a gown, a royal cloak. A makeshift coronet fashioned from straw and flowers crowned the head of a queen, while her knight brandished a stick like it was forged steel. These games were often whispered, especially if the manor's steward or priest passed by. Mocking the nobility, even in jest, could be frowned upon. But the children weren't mocking, they were imagining, not with malice but with wonder. What would it be like to feast on silver platters, to ride horses not for ploughing but for parade, to command rather than obey? But for now, picture a barefoot girl in a flower crown, standing on a tree stump, declaring herself queen of the village while her friends cheer in delight. For that moment, she is regal. Not by birth, but by the boundless grace of childhood imagination. And when spring came, real spring, not the shy hints of thaw, but full bloom and sunlight and warm soil underfoot, the games children played needed no props at all. They needed only open fields, tangled wildflowers, and the giddy freedom of bare feet. This was the season of maypoles and flower crowns, of running until your lungs burned and laughing until your voice cracked. By the time the meadows burst into bloom and the trees wore soft green canopies, most of the village children had already started their own spring rituals, quietly mirroring the adults who turned their eyes to the planting season. But while grown-ups watched the skies for rain and signs from the saints, the children turned to mischief. They called their games by many names: Castle Court, Feast Day, the High King's Visit. Rules were loose, roles constantly shifting. One child played the Lord, strutting about with a stick as a staff. Another became the cook, mixing weeds and well water in an old bucket. There was usually a jester, someone small and silly who leapt around cracking jokes, echoing the laughter they had heard during real holidays in the village square. Girls often led these dramas, assigning roles, laying out bits of broken pottery like banquet dishes, organising pretend marriages between reluctant boys and giggling friends. Even the family dog might be roped in, given a crown of weeds and declared the royal boar. Sometimes they snuck glimpses of noble life directly. A passing cart laden with goods for the manor kitchen, a glimpse through an open window during a feast or a festival where the noble family processed through the village in velvet and gold. These moments stuck in children's minds like dreams. They borrowed them later for play. They mimicked the accents, the bows, the rituals. They practiced noble greetings, sometimes getting it all wrong. but that was part of the charm. "My lady," a mud-smeared child might say with a deep curtsy, only to fall backward into a puddle. Everyone would howl with laughter. There was an element of daring in it, too. Pretending to be what you were not required boldness. And every now and then, the game crossed a line. A boy might tie too many ribbons to his tunic and be scolded by his father. "You're not the Earl's son." A girl might strut too proudly and be warned, "Best not act above your place." The reminders were sharp, but never permanent. The next day, the children played again. Even the materials told stories. A spoon lost in the manor garden might become the royal sceptre. A cracked shard of a stained glass window found near the chapel turned into a magic gem. These objects were borrowed treasures, carried home in pockets, hidden beneath straw, shown only to trusted friends. And during festival seasons, especially near midsummer or harvest, these games took on greater. Older children led full plays in the fields, imitating noble banquets with dance and song. Some adults watched, amused or indulgent, letting the mimicry pass as long as no names were used and no offence was given. Even grown-ups deep down understood that imitation was also admiration. Because despite the gaps in class, children shared one truth. They saw more than they were told. They watched carefully. They remembered details, and when they played, they wove those pieces into something uniquely their own. A world where they ruled, feasted, and danced as grandly as any lord. Next, we'll move from mimicry to mayhem. How dares, pranks, and the art of mischief turned games into trouble, and how even the best intentions could end with a missing chicken or a broken cartwheel. Effin' magic. The maypole, when there was one, was a borrowed joy. In some villages, it was no more than a tall branch dug into the earth, stripped of its bark and festooned with whatever ribbons, twine, or dyed wool scraps could be found. In others, where traditions ran deeper, the pole was raised with fanfare and draped in garlands collected by girls at dawn. Either way, it stood tall in the centre of the green, a silent invitation to whirl. Children learned the dance not from instruction but from watching, mimicking the criss-crossing steps of the older girls, the weaves and turns that wrapped the pole in spirals of colour. Boys joined too, though often with less grace and more noise, chasing one another around the base, sometimes tangling the ribbons on purpose just for a laugh. They called it maypole mischief, and it usually ended with someone scolded and everyone delighted. On the edges of these festivities bloomed flower games, quiet competitions and playful traditions built around the season's brief beauty. Girls wove crowns of daisies and dandelions, testing whose held firm the longest. Some would string wild garlic into chains, declaring it protection against woodland fairies or wicked sisters. Boys, not to be left out, might craft leafy swords or fill their sleeves with buttercups and pretend they were gold coins. There was a language to these flowers. A crown of violets meant you were queen for the day. A garland of nettles declared a duel. Tossing petals at someone's feet was either a sign of admiration or a very creative insult. It all depended on the game. One favourite activity was the flower challenge. Who could collect the most different blooms before the bell rang for supper? The rules varied. Some played by colour, others by height. The best games ended with a ragtag bouquet thrust toward a parent or neighbour, dirt still clinging to the roots, faces flushed with pride. Springtime also brought the chance to mimic marriage ceremonies, especially among girls who had seen enough real weddings to piece together their own version. With flower veils and acorn rings, they staged dramatic vows under blooming trees, their chosen bride and groom often blushing or giggling too much to speak. Sometimes a chicken stood in as a witness, sometimes the family goat. For younger children, the joy was simpler still, just the feeling of the earth beneath them, warm and forgiving, the air filled with birdsong and bees. They rolled down hills, plucked clover until their fingers stained green, and let the sunshine catch in their hair. In these moments, they weren't playing at nobility or mimicking adults. They were simply alive, and the world itself was their toy. Even the adults softened a little in spring. When the fields had been planted, and before the first weeds rose too high, there was time to linger, to watch the children dance and laugh and chase one another around the maypole. For a moment, it seemed the hardships of winter had been lifted, not forgotten, but set aside. And so spring became more than a season. It became permission to frolic, to imagine, to misbehave in ways the snow and frost had made impossible. The maypole was not just a pole, it was a flag for childhood, a ribboned monument to joy. Next, we'll head into the heat of summer, where fun became sticky, dusty, and occasionally muddy, and the games turned to water splashing, hay stacking races, and sneaky nibbles from berry bushes that weren't quite ripe. But for now, picture a child dancing barefoot through wildflowers, a crown of daisies on her head, ribbon trailing from her fingers. The pole spins, the laughter rings, and for just one springtime afternoon, the world feels timeless. But if spring belonged to flowers and ribbons, a different sort of play came with the calendar's more mischievous turns, when the usual order could be turned on its head, and children were no longer just watchers or mimics. For a single day, sometimes two, they could become the rulers, the jesters, the judges, lords of nonsense and queens of absurdity. This was Fool's Day, and at its heart were games of inversion, mock crowns, and a joyful defiance of the everyday. Though we think of April Fool's Day as a more modern invention, medieval Europe had long known its own rituals of reversal. In churches, Feast of Fools celebrations allowed junior clergy to parody their seniors. In villages, similar spirits seeped into seasonal customs, especially around midwinter or the tail end of harvest. And in these moments of permitted silliness, children often found a rare kind of power. The mock king or lord of misrule, titles which sound grand but were chosen with laughter, might be selected by drawing straws or finding the hidden token in a piece of bread. Sometimes it was the loudest child or the cleverest, or simply the one who had never yet had a turn. Once crowned, perhaps with a ring of dried thistle or a cabbage leaf, the mock ruler held court. Their reign might last a day or just an afternoon, but during that time, rules bent. The king could issue silly proclamations. All must hop like frogs, no one may speak without singing, boys must curtsy and girls must bow. Obedience was expected, but only in jest. The fun came from following absurdity to its limit and seeing how long one could stay in character without laughing. Children prepared for this day like a feast. Garlands were made, faces painted with mud or crushed berries and old clothes turned inside out. One girl might declare herself Queen of the Turnips and insist on being carried on a wooden cart like a noble procession. Another boy, wearing his father's old cloak backwards, might ride a stick horse through the village square, yelling mock judgments. "You there, accused of stealing all the sunshine, guilty!" Adults, when they noticed, often played along or at least tolerated the noise. Fool's Day was a kind of release valve, a moment when children could let loose the pressure of chores, of expectations, of growing up too fast. It allowed for nonsense, and in that nonsense, a kind of learning about leadership, humour, fairness, and the power of words. Some games mirrored the traditions of older fools' feasts. A pretend confession circle where each child had to admit to silly crimes. I stole a pie made of wind, or I made a cat sneeze 3 times. The more absurd, the better. Laughter was the goal, but also the glue. It was a shared rebellion, brief and kind, and everyone took part. Of course, the crowns rarely lasted. A muddy fall, a jealous sibling, or simply the setting sun brought the kingdom back to its senses. The cabbage wilted, the stick sceptre snapped. The court dissolved into running and shouting and whatever game came next. But for that sliver of the day, the children had ruled, not through strength or wealth, but by the sheer weight of their imagination, and sometimes in rare moments Fool's Day blurred into actual village festivals. On those occasions, perhaps a wedding, a saint's day, or the end of harvest, the adults might assign a mock crown to the youngest among them, and hoist him or her up before a laughing crowd. There, on a barrel or a wagon, the child would shout blessings or make jokes, basking in applause. It was silly, but it mattered, because in a world where childhood could be short and expectations heavy, a moment of joyful power was unforgettable. Next, we'll drift toward the quieter side of medieval childhood once again, those peaceful moments with riddles, chants, and whispered rhymes passed from one generation to the next. But for now, picture a barefoot king in a muddy tunic, grinning from ear to ear, waving a crooked stick over his loyal followers as they dance around a pig pen. It's ridiculous, it's undignified, and for one perfect hour, it's exactly right. When the Mock kings had stepped down and the cabbage crowns were wilted in the dust. When the children returned to chores and the sun dipped toward its evening rest, a different kind of magic sometimes wandered into town. Not worn from the children's games, but carried in on tired feet, painted wagons, and the clang of bells that signalled something special had arrived. Street performers, troops, puppet masters and tumblers. To the medieval child, these were figures of mystery, mischief and wonder. They didn't come often, but when they did, word spread quickly. A juggler in the square, a man balancing on a pole, a woman who could dance on rope and sing like a bird. Children swarmed toward the commotion, abandoning tasks and tumbling over one another for a better view. Even the grumpiest elders peered from doorways, and the village dogs barked excitedly at the gathering crowd. The performers might have been no more than a couple with clever hands and a worn-out lute, or an entire wagon painted in fading colours, drawn by a mule with a ribbon in its mane. But what they brought was a taste of another world, a place where apples balanced on heads, plates spun on sticks, and puppets told tales both wicked and wise. The puppet shows in particular held a special place in children's hearts. With a simple curtained booth, often constructed right there in the square or near the tavern wall, the show began. Behind the curtain, wooden figures came to life, jerky, crude, but somehow completely believable to the wide-eyed audience before them. They had voices, nasal, squeaky, or booming, provided by the puppeteer who worked unseen, crouched low and nimble. The stories varied. Sometimes they were cautionary tales, fables twisted to suit the crowd about greedy bakers or lazy shepherds. Other times they mimicked the grander plays of noble courts, with kings and dragons, fools and witches. But more often than not, they made fun of real life, a clumsy blacksmith, a nagging grandmother, a sneaky priest. Children howled with laughter, adults smirked behind their mugs. Everyone saw a bit of themselves in the puppet's wooden wobble. For many children, this was their first theatre, their first play. They mimicked the voices long after the troupe had gone. They carved their own puppets from sticks or scraps, setting up booths made of laundry lines and blankets. Their siblings became audiences. Their parents became critics. Some even dreamed, quietly, secretly, of running off to join the wagon and bring laughter to towns of their own. And then there were the tumblers, acrobats with bodies like ribbon and rope, cartwheeling through the square, leaping through hoops, standing on one another's shoulders with impossible balance. Children didn't just cheer, they gasped, they clutched each other's arms, they stared, trying to understand how a man could walk on his hands or a woman could twist like a vine. These acts were not only entertaining, they were inspiring. In the days that followed, village children attempted their own versions. A fence post became a balance beam. A haystack became a tumbling mat. Someone always scraped a knee, someone always fell too hard, but no one stopped trying. Because now they had seen that joy could be movement, that laughter could be earned through risk and surprise. Even the songs stuck around, rhythms and rhymes that filtered into the fields and lanes long after the performers had gone. They were repeated at play, hummed while sweeping, tapped out on tabletops with sticks. A good show didn't end when the wagon left. It echoed quietly in the life that came after. And though most children never left their village, never followed the brightly painted cart to the next town, the idea that such a life was possible remained, like a seed tucked deep in the mind waiting for the right season. Next, we'll step into the quieter spaces again, into the chants and riddles whispered between friends, the memory games passed down like heirlooms, and the songs sung not for performance but for company. But for now, picture a crowd of barefoot children in the dust, mouths open, eyes wide, as a puppet in a painted booth raises a tiny fist and declares, in a voice too bold for its size, "I'll steal the baker's pies and dance in the moonlight." And just like that, the whole world laughs. But when the laughter faded and the painted wagon rolled on toward the next town, the children returned to their daily places, those familiar corners of village life where joy still lived, even without puppets or tumblers. For not all fun needed a travelling show. Some of it unfolded in the very heart of the community, in spaces that were always there, the open village square, the dusty courtyards of local taverns, the worn edges of wells and bakehouses where people naturally gathered. These spaces weren't designed for children, but they made room for them all the same. There were no locked gates or signs that said playground, no boundaries painted in colour. The square was a living place, flat and open, often packed earth or cobbled stone, sometimes a bit of both. Chickens might peck near the edge, a cart might roll slowly through, wheels creaking, and still, children would dart between it all, alive in the centre of village life. During the day, the square pulsed with rhythm, the clack of hooves, the call of vendors, the shouts of a shepherd trying to corral a wandering goat. Children learned to move around it all, slipping between market stalls, hovering near ovens when bread was cooling, watching the blacksmith from a safe distance as sparks flew like tiny stars. Their games unfolded right beside the grown-up world, often imitating it. A row of pebbles became a market stall. A bent stick became a tax collector. Play and work weren't separated, they danced beside each other. The tavern courtyard was another story, a little rougher, a little rowdier. But on quiet afternoons, or before evening brought too much ale and noise, it became a kind of unofficial nursery. While parents haggled or drank or rested, children found corners to explore. They chased hens between benches. They played hide the token among firewood piles. They eavesdropped badly on gossip not meant for young ears, and in doing so they stitched themselves into the life of the village. No one announced these places as safe zones. They simply became them through habit and necessity. Grandmothers with tired knees watched from benches. Young mothers bounced babies in one arm while tossing pebbles to entertain toddlers. Older siblings were tasked with keeping the youngest out of trouble, but often got distracted themselves by a game or a tale. In these public spaces, the age lines blurred. A 12-year-old might sit beside a 60-year-old and listen to a story that had nothing to do with games. A 5-year-old might toddle after a teenage cousin, wide-eyed and eager, convinced that whatever they were doing, fixing a bucket, chalking a hot pattern onto stone, was something sacred. And when something truly exciting happened, a minstrel arriving, a sheep giving birth right in the middle of the lane, a noble rider clattering through on business, everyone saw it together. The children's gasps echoed the adults. Their questions tumbled out, answered or not. The square was a stage, yes, but it was also a classroom, a marketplace of stories and impressions. It wasn't always peaceful. Older boys might roughhouse too close to the well. A game might turn into an argument. A scolding might ring out across the courtyard, sharp and familiar. But even that was part of the pattern. The square forgave, the courtyard endured. And in winter, when snow dusted the stones and tavern fires burned warmer than ever, the courtyards and squares didn't fall silent. They simply changed shape. Children huddled closer. They carved tiny trails through frost. They made small snowmen with stick arms and pig bladder hats. They stomped footprints beside the grown-ups' boots and drew suns in the snow with their fingers, dreaming of spring. These were not playgrounds in the modern sense, but they were the beating heart of the medieval childhood world. Open, shared, loud, then quiet, dusty, then muddy, then dry again. They held all ages, all seasons, and all kinds of fun. Next, we'll end our journey where many childhood days ended, in the soft quiet of song and rhyme, memory and repetition. The lullabies and riddles passed hand to hand, lip to ear like small treasures. But for now, picture a sun-warmed square filled with chicken feathers and laughter, a child darting past a laundry line, another crouched near a stone bench, whispering secrets into the cracks of the earth. For all the play that was reckless, absurd, or pure fantasy, there was also a kind of fun that echoed the work that waited ahead, not just in jest, but in practice. In the village square, the courtyard, and the open pastures beyond, children mimicked their parents' lives, not simply because it amused them, but because it was how they learned to become who they were expected to be. It was play with purpose, pretend farming, herding games, not assigned, but adopted. Children who watched their fathers sow barley in neat rows took to scratching lines in the dirt with sticks. Some used broken branches as makeshift ploughs, dragging them behind as they mimicked the slow, wide steps of an ox. A doll wrapped in rags might become a sickle, waved awkwardly in the air as they harvested handfuls of tall weeds and wildflowers. In autumn, when the fields were being cleared and gleaners combed the stubble, small hands followed after. They weren't expected to bring in much, but They picked anyway, learning to spot what had been missed, stuffing scraps of grain or stray pods into aprons or baskets woven from willow shoots. Sometimes they made a game of it. Who could find the most before the bell tolled or before mother's voice called from across the yard? In corners of farmyards and clearings behind cottages, herding games unfolded, where chickens stood in for cows and younger siblings for sheep. Children waved sticks like crooks, shouted in imitation of their fathers or uncles, and corralled imaginary livestock into corners marked with stones or lengths of fallen fence. The livestock were rarely cooperative, especially if they were siblings. But even the chaos had a lesson in it. To herd was to watch carefully, to read movement, to stay alert. These games sharpened instincts. A child who chased chickens today might steer geese tomorrow. A child who mimicked the shepherd's whistle would soon learn to recognize the real call and understand its meaning. Girls in particular practiced domestic echoes. While their brothers drove invisible oxen across the earth, they arranged pantries in hollow logs, tucked pretend root vegetables into pits like storage cellars, or built clay ovens from sun-dried mud. Sometimes they carried turnips like babies or tucked dry herbs into their aprons with the same reverence their mothers showed towards sage and thyme. And though it was play, it wasn't all light-hearted. The children knew that what they mimicked today would soon become expectation. There was comfort in knowing what was coming, and sometimes dread. But within the mimicry, there was still joy. A child might grumble about sweeping a hearth for real, but spend hours playing at sweeping a castle made of fallen stones. Even tools were copied. A stick could be a hoe, a bucket lid, a ploughshare. Pieces of broken pottery became pretend knives. A bent piece of iron became a branding mark pressed into imaginary flanks. Often the tools weren't shared, they were built, guarded, improved upon. The most elaborate games happened at the edge of the fields, where no adult was watching too closely. Children staked out tiny farms, plotted little borders with rocks and twigs. They argued over boundaries. They held pretend markets with stones and dandelions as currency. A cow dung pat might stand in for manure, ceremoniously spread to bless a patch of dry grass that had been deemed barley. And when animals wandered too close, the children adjusted, sometimes recruiting the dog to be a stand-in ox, or scattering when the real geese charged. The line between pretend and practice blurred, as it always does in a childhood shaped by necessity. Still, they laughed. Still, they made up new rules. Still, they named their pretend cows and prayed fake prayers for their pretend crops. Because even if the future was set, marriage, harvests, touch, there was freedom in imagining yourself already capable, already grown, already able to do what your parents did, but maybe just a little bit better. Next, we'll slip into the most enduring part of any childhood, the quiet, rhythmic sharing of stories and songs, riddles, rhymes and lullabies passed from one mouth to the next, as precious and lasting as any field full of grain. But for now, picture a barefoot child at the edge of a furrowed path, dragging a crooked stick through the dirt in perfect lines, while another holds a flower like it's the key to the whole harvest. They're farming, they're learning, but mostly they're playing. And yet not all play came in the form of games. Sometimes the most satisfying kind of fun was quiet, still, and shaped by the hands. Crafting in all its humble forms was both a necessity and a pastime in medieval childhood. For many, it began not as duty, but as curiosity, then comfort, and eventually skill. Long before they were asked to stitch seams or shape tools with real consequences, children watched. They saw mothers spinning wool with practiced fingers, heard the soft clack of needles in winter's hush. They sat near fathers who carved handles by the hearth, or brothers whittling toy carts out of firewood scraps. And slowly, without being told, their own fingers began to itch. A piece of straw became a weaving experiment. A smooth stone became a pendant. A broken spoon became something entirely new. To craft was to mimic, but also to make something that stayed. While games blew away like dust on the wind, a whittled figure or braided cord could be kept, shown off, given as a gift, or hidden away like treasure. For young girls, the first stitches were often playful. Loops of thread sewn into scraps, old linen turned into doll dresses, torn hems repurposed for bandages in pretend sick beds. Sometimes older women would indulge these efforts with a patient smile, showing them how to thread a needle without tangles or how to anchor a corner so it wouldn't fray. In the quiet warmth of long evenings, girls sat together and sewed for practice, then for pride. A crooked line of embroidery might become the hem of a toy cloak. Dried flower petals could be tucked into little pouches made of discarded cloth. Even spinning, so vital, so constant in the medieval home, had a rhythm that pulled children close. A drop spindle, once offered as a plaything, taught balance, patience, and the simple joy of twist and spin. For boys, the blade was a badge of age. At first they only watched, but soon enough they were handed their own small, dull knives and taught the art of carving, cautiously, clumsily, but with growing confidence. A bit of driftwood could become a horse, a stick might become a flute. Many failed attempts filled the firewood pile, but each one taught something new. And whittling wasn't only for the boys. Some girls picked up blades too, carving small dolls, charms, or game pieces. In villages where survival trumped formality, skill was welcomed, no matter who owned the hands. Even the smallest children learned to twist straw into figures, to roll wool into balls, to smooth clay with thumbs and press in patterns with buttons or bones. These crafts had purpose. The dolls might entertain younger siblings. The woven cords could become laces or straps. But more than that, they gave the child ownership over something real. A carved bird on a windowsill. A pouch hung from a belt. A stitched patch admired by a neighbour. Children also learned through stories whispered while hands worked. Rhymes passed back and forth to keep fingers steady. A girl learning to stitch might hear a tale with every tug of the thread. A boy carving might be told the story of how his grandfather once carved a flute that made a bear dance, likely untrue but mesmerising all the same. These moments of making were also moments of peace. While the world outside might be hard and loud, the rhythm of crafting was steady and soft, the thread pulled smooth, the wood shaved away in curls, the hush of focused breath, the shared space around a hearth, the flicker of lamplight on busy hands. And when winter closed in and there was little to gather or chase outdoors, crafting often became the centre of evening fun. Leftover scraps became art, bits of chalk were used to draw patterns on walls or slates, children painted with berry juice, etched with nails, tied feathers onto sticks and declared them arrows. Creation was celebration, and it was woven into daily life as naturally as bread or breath. Next, we'll curl into those final hours of the medieval day, into lullabies, riddles, and whispered games passed between children, kept alive by memory and voice alone. But for now, picture a young child cross-legged by the fire, proudly holding up a misshapen but recognisable wooden rabbit, carved with care, sanded with a stone, and polished with the warmth of small hands and endless imagination. And once it was finished, once the carving was admired, the doll clothed, the top spun smooth across the table, there was only one thing left to do: give it life. Because for all the whittling and stitching, medieval childhood was animated by stories, not just those told by elders near the hearth, though those were treasures, but stories retold by children themselves, twisted and reimagined in yards and fields and dusty corners. Stories in which the children were not just listening, but starring. This was role play before the word existed, when being a hero or dragon didn't require costumes or stage lights. Just a good stick, a willing friend, and the permission to believe, just for a while, that the barn was a castle, the pigsty a prison, and the apple tree a tower high enough to see the whole kingdom. Some stories were old. Folk tales heard from a grandmother's cracked voice, saintly legends murmured in the churchyard, or gossip about distant battles made grander in retelling. Others were entirely invented, created in the moment, wild and absurd, and better because of it. Children assigned roles quickly. One would be the brave knight, another the captured maid or the wicked giant. Someone, often the littlest or the most willing, would become the dragon, arms spread wide, roaring with laughter and stomping through the grass in clumsy menace. These roles weren't static. They shifted with each game, reshaped to suit the mood. The same child who had been the villain yesterday might claim the sword of virtue today. A goat might be recruited into the tale as a magical steed. A log became a bridge. A puddle became a moat. No part of the village was off limits to the imagination. A row of hedges became a maze, a line of stones, a dangerous path. The large communal oven, cold and unused, was sometimes whispered to be the belly of a sleeping troll. It wasn't just make-believe. It was meaning assigned to the everyday. And through these stories, children processed more than fun. They explored fear, imagining battles with monsters or escapes from dungeons. They tested loyalty, forming groups and alliances, arguing over who would betray the queen or steal the treasure. They learned empathy, sometimes reluctantly, by becoming the villain and seeing how it felt to lose. Sometimes these tales were performed for others. A few brave children might put on a play of sorts, drawing in siblings or neighbours as audience. There were no scripts, only the loose bones of a tale and the freedom to improvise. Capes were made from old cloaks, swords from firewood, crowns from straw. The storytelling wasn't polished, but it was alive. Even solitary children played out stories in their own way. A lone child might wander through a pasture narrating an epic aloud, half to themselves, half to the birds. A girl might braid flower stems and talk to invisible fairies. A boy might line up stones and march a legion of beetles toward a grand imaginary siege. What mattered most wasn't the audience, but the transformation. For a brief moment, the child wasn't a peasant's son or a farmer's daughter. They were a hero, a sorcerer, a queen in hiding. The small burdens of real life, chores, hunger, mud-caked feet, could be exchanged for glory, triumph, or escape, if only for an hour. And when the stories ended, they often lingered in objects. A sword carved that morning still carried yesterday's victory. A doll still wore the name of a princess rescued from wolves. A stick leaning against the wall still remembered being a staff of power, just waiting for its next wielder. These quiet, communal fantasies were not wasteful. They were the early rehearsals of adulthood, explorations of power, fairness, courage, and cleverness. And though their dragons weren't real and their spells were made of dandelion fluff, the emotions were honest. The pride, the fear, the joy. Next, we'll step into the softer echoes of play, the rhymes and riddles whispered at dusk, the memory games passed down like patchwork quilts, stitched with repetition and rhythm. But for now, picture a barefoot child standing on a log, arm raised in triumph, shouting across the yard to no one in particular, "The beast is slain!" The village is saved and believing it, heart and soul. But not every game involved dragons, kingdoms, or the clashing of imaginary swords. Some took place in the quiet moments, in doorways, on thresholds, or beside flickering hearths. These were the games of memory and skill passed from mouth to mouth, generation to generation, with the same care one might give a family recipe or a well-worn prayer. They didn't require tools, no carved toys or bundled dolls, just a voice, a rhythm, a challenge. Some of these games were as old as the villages themselves. Riddles, in particular, held a place of honour, part game, part education. Children learned to listen closely as elders posed questions wrapped in metaphor. What runs but has no feet? What has a mouth but never speaks? The riddles were small puzzles meant to stretch the mind. They taught attention, creativity, and language. And though many were repeated from memory, the best children often made up their own, offering a riddle so clever it earned a chuckle from a tired mother or a grunt of approval from an ageing grandfather. Others favoured rhyming chants and memory chains. One child would start with a word or phrase, perhaps the name of an animal, a saint, or a vegetable, and each child had to repeat it and add another. The chain grew longer and more tangled with every round, until someone stumbled and the others laughed, not unkindly, but triumphantly. These games were often played during work, while fetching water, weaving baskets, or picking weeds. The rhythm helped pass the time, and the challenge kept small minds sharp. There were finger games too. Quiet, focused contests played by firelight or on church steps when talking needed to be hushed. Children would tap fingers in sequences, mirror each other's movements, or try to snatch a hand away before being caught. These were deceptively simple, but taught dexterity and timing, skills that mattered in a world where hands would soon need to spin, carve, or wield tools with precision. Some games focused on counting and order, planting the seeds of arithmetic in young minds. Pebbles might be lined up in rows, shuffled behind hands, or used in quick addition challenges. Though formal schooling was rare, particularly for peasant children, these games were a kind of education, tucked inside play. They made the abstract feel real. numbers became stones, repetition became understanding. And there were call and response games, especially during long evenings. One child would recite a line and another had to answer in kind. These were often poetic, sometimes nonsensical and full of charm. They might start solemn, "In the hall of the moon, what creature sleeps?" and end with laughter, "A pig with a crown and muddy feet." The point wasn't accuracy, but rhythm, participation, the way words could be passed back and forth like kindling for thought. What united all these games, riddles, rhymes, memory chains, hand claps, was that they were played together, often across age groups. A 6-year-old might be paired with a 10-year-old. A grandmother might join in. There was no need for rules written in chalk or carved in stone. The rules were remembered and taught through play. And within this play was preparation. Not just for literacy or calculation, but for life. A child who mastered a riddle might grow into a clever merchant. A girl who counted pebbles with precision might one day track hens and eggs with ease. A boy who clapped hands in rhythm might wield a scythe with natural timing. These little contests of wit and memory taught not only fun, but focus, patience, and confidence. Even the smallest children were included. They were given the easy parts, the echoing lines, the simpler verses. But with every repetition, they grew. They listened more closely, they waited for their turn, and one day they remembered enough to start the chain themselves. In the world of the medieval child, fun and function were rarely separate. A game was never just a game. It was a lesson wrapped in laughter, a challenge shared by candlelight, a way to pass the time while growing into the person they were meant to become. Next, we'll close our journey through medieval childhood with a final look at the echoes of those early years, the songs and sayings that lingered, the memories pressed like leaves between the pages of life. But for now, picture two children seated on a stone step, their voices soft in the twilight, trading riddles back and forth as the evening settles and the stars begin to blink open. And then, like always, the day would end. A yawn, a call from a doorway, a final scuffle over who won the last round, feet brushed off, crumbs shaken from aprons, a carved toy tucked beneath a fold of cloth for safekeeping. The sky faded slowly, no abrupt lights, no clicks or screens, just the colour draining gently until the world turned to ink and ash. The game stopped not because they were finished, but because it was time, always time. The sun dipped, the pots needed scrubbing, the chickens needed closing in, someone had forgotten to fetch water. A younger sibling needed help with laces or needed calming after a scuffle. And still, the children smiled, not with the sadness of endings, but the knowing grin of those who've tasted something that would surely come again. Because in the medieval world, where much of life was uncertain, repetitive and difficult, play was a quiet constant. The same stick sword would lie where it was dropped. The same tree would welcome a climber. The same rhyme, once whispered, would echo again tomorrow, perhaps altered slightly, perhaps passed to someone new, but never lost. There was comfort in this return, in the retelling, in the replaying, in the same games picked up after chores were done, with the same friends, on the same dusty patch behind the cottage. It wasn't boring. It was ritual. It was belonging. Even when children outgrew the smallest games, they watched others begin them anew. A younger sister would begin to weave scraps of cloth like a doll blanket. A new boy in the village would start practicing his whistle to herd geese the same way the older boys once had. And though they were no longer the ones pretending to be dragons, they still smiled when they heard someone roar behind the woodpile. In this world, change came slowly, but childhood moved quickly, and so each repetition mattered more. Each familiar movement carved a groove, not just in time, but in memory. And in this carving, just like with a stick under a blade, something lasting was shaped. They would do it again tomorrow, not out of boredom, not because they lacked imagination, but because that's what joy was, finding meaning in the familiar and magic in the ordinary. So now, dear listener, as the fire dwindles and the air grows still, we leave behind the laughter of the yard and the echoes of old rhymes. The children are tucked in, the carved rabbit rests on the windowsill, and the riddles will wait until morning. They weren't princes or nobles. They had no treasure chests or stages. But in every carved toy, every barefoot chase, every whisper of legend beneath the trees, medieval children showed us something beautiful. That fun doesn't need luxury, just time and space and each other. They played hard. They played smart. They played to understand the world they were growing into. And tomorrow, after the eggs were gathered and the floor swept and the goats fed, they would do it all again. And so will we, in our own ways, finding rhythm, finding joy, finding meaning in small things repeated. If you're still awake, thank you for spending this quiet time with me. If you've drifted off, may your dreams be filled with castles made of hay, goats with flower crowns, and riddles that only the wind can answer. Until next time, friends, sleep well.